Nobody who studies this subject casually ever quite prepares for how far the Imperial Japanese Navy actually fell, and how fast. The same fleet that crossed the Pacific undetected in December 1941, with 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers, arranged into a strike force that had never been attempted at that scale before, was by October 1944 a shadow of itself, attempting a last desperate gamble in Philippine waters with ships it could no longer protect from the air. The distance between those two moments is not just 3 years of fighting. It is the story of an institution that collided with the arithmetic of industrial war and lost. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft reached Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. Kate torpedo bombers carrying aerial torpedoes weighing roughly 1,760 pounds each, Val dive bombers descending at steep angles, Zero fighters maintaining top cover at around 14,000 feet. In roughly 90 minutes, 8 American battleships were hit, 5 of them sunk or beached, and 2,403 Americans were dead. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. Standing at the numbers alone, it reads like a perfect operation. The Kido Butai, the mobile carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had punched across 2,200 miles of open Pacific without a single ship being spotted. For the men in those carriers, watching the aircraft return, the morning felt decisive. It was not. The 3 American carriers assigned to the Pacific, Lexington, Saratoga, Enterprise, were all at sea that day. None were in port. None were touched. What I keep returning to every time I work through this period is how completely Japanese naval planners misread the timeline they were operating on. The oil embargo that the United States imposed in July 1941 had cut off roughly 80% of Japan's oil imports, and the Navy was burning through its strategic reserve at a rate that gave planners no more than roughly 2 years of sustained operations before the fleet stalled. The whole Pacific strategy, the seizure of resource territories in Southeast Asia, the construction of a defensive perimeter, the plan to bleed American resolve in a series of attrition engagements, was designed to work within that 2-year window. What nobody on the Japanese side had calculated precisely enough was how quickly American shipyards and aircraft factories would replace every loss. Midway, in June 1942, closed that window ahead of schedule. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went to the bottom in a single day, along with roughly 292 aircraft and approximately 3,000 sailors and airmen, including more than 200 of the most experienced carrier pilots in the IJN. Replacement pilots trained on a fraction of the hours their predecessors had accumulated. Where a pre-war IJN carrier aviator had trained for roughly 500 to 800 hours before his first combat assignment, wartime replacements were flying into combat on barely a third of that. The loss at Midway was not just 4 hulls, it was the irreplaceable depth of a generation of aircrew, and the Navy never recovered it. The middle period, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign through 1942 and 43 bled the IJN in slow increments. In the Philippine Sea engagement of June 1944, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed somewhere between 600 and 700 Japanese aircraft in 2 days, an exchange that became known informally as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots by that point were so poorly trained that some could barely execute basic aerial gunnery, their hands uncertain on controls they had not sat behind long enough. The carrier force that launched those aircraft had assembled 9 carriers for the battle. By October 1944, when the fleet converged on Leyte Gulf for what would be its final coherent surface operation, 4 of those carriers were being used as deliberate bait, empty of effective aircraft, sailing as decoys to draw American carrier groups away from the main surface thrust. Leyte Gulf was the end. Over 4 days from the 23rd to the 26th of October, 1944, the IJN lost 3 battleships, 1 large fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. 26 ships in total, sunk or put permanently out of action. Japanese casualties reached approximately 12,000 dead. The United States lost 6 ships and roughly 3,000 men. What remained of the Japanese surface fleet had no fuel to operate systematically, no air cover to protect its movements, and no base of pilots who could reverse either condition. The fleet that had trained for decades on gunnery excellence and night torpedo work, the fleet that had genuinely outfought American surface forces at multiple engagements earlier in the war, simply ceased to be a coherent fighting force after those 4 days. If the hour is late where you are, and you are already settling in, let that image carry you somewhere quiet for a moment. 6 carriers riding north in the dark of December 1941, their pilots sleeping in their bunks 4 hours before the launch order. And then, 3 years later, those same carriers all gone, their replacements gone, the men who flew from them mostly gone, and a fleet burning what little remaining fuel it had, just to position itself for one last operation it could not win. The full distance between those 2 moments, every battle, every decision, every ship and every pilot and every ton of aviation fuel that moved the story from one end to the other, is what this documentary carries. This is the entire history of the Imperial Japanese Navy, from Pearl Harbor triumph to Leyte Gulf annihilation. To understand the Imperial Japanese Navy at the moment it went to war, you have to understand what kind of institution had built it and what that institution believed war at sea actually was. The IJN, as it's almost universally abbreviated, the Imperial Japanese Navy, had been constructed across 6 decades on the explicit model of the British Royal Navy, then reshaped under the influence of the American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, and finally transformed into something distinctly its own by a generation of officers who had grown up watching Japan emerge from feudal isolation to become a regional great power in less than 40 years. They were, by any measure, an extraordinary group of professionals. They were also professionals shaped by a strategic culture that had one overwhelming answer to one overwhelming question. How does a small island nation with limited industrial resources defeat a much larger and more wealthy opponent? The answer was the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. Win everything in one engagement before the weight of the enemy's industrial and demographic superiority can be brought to bear. It was not an irrational doctrine. It was a doctrine built for a war that would last 6 months. The navy that Kantai-Kessen produced was, in December of 1941, an extraordinary instrument. 10 fleet carriers, 10 battleships, 36 cruisers, 113 destroyers, 63 submarines, approximately 3,500 carrier-qualified pilots, each of whom had accumulated, and this number matters enormously, so hold on to it, an average of 800 flying hours before receiving a fleet assignment. 800 hours. To put that in context, a contemporary American naval aviator completing training in late 1941 typically had somewhere between 200 and 300 hours. The gap in quality was staggering, and the IJN knew it, and the IJN relied on it, and in doing so created a war-winning advantage that was also a non-renewable resource. Those 800-hour pilots could not be replaced on any timeline that would matter to a long war. The Navy's greatest strength was a quantity of 1. There were structural choices baked into the IJN's design that illuminated the Kantai-Kessen philosophy with painful clarity. Take the long lance torpedo, the Type 93, pure oxygen-propelled, 610 millimeters in diameter, 9 meters long, with a range of 40,000 meters at 36 knots, and a warhead of 490 kilograms of explosive. It was, in raw specification terms, the finest surface-launched torpedo in any navy in the world. The engineering achievement required to make pure oxygen propulsion work reliably, preventing spontaneous detonation in the injector manifold through machined brass sealing components, measured in fractions of a millimeter, was genuinely remarkable. Japanese torpedo technicians spent more man-hours per weapon than American engineers spent on entire destroyer gun systems, and the long lance was almost useless against submarines and aircraft. The two weapon systems that would ultimately destroy the IJN. The designers had built the perfect answer to the wrong question. Or consider the Zero, the Mitsubishi A6M, designed by a team led by Jiro Horikoshi, assembled in response to a 1937 Naval Air Staff specification that demanded capabilities: range exceeding 1,600 kilometers with drop tanks, speed above 500 kilometers per hour, climb rate of 3,000 meters in 3.5 minutes, and maneuverability superior to any existing fighter, that Horikoshi himself described in his memoir as sitting at the extreme boundary of what aerodynamics then permitted. He met every specification. To do so, he accepted a structural safety factor of 1.8 gravities, less than 2/3 of the standard 3-gravity specification for naval aircraft. He knew what he was trading. The Naval Air Staff accepted the trade. Range was everything. Survivability was the price. I want to be specific about one more structural failure, because it is the one that is most consistently underemphasized in popular historical treatments of this war. The Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy did not share a command structure below the level of the Emperor himself. They had separate procurement systems, separate strategic planning processes, separate communication protocols, and a history of institutional rivalry so bitter that it sometimes resembled operational hostility more than inter-service competition. There was no Japanese equivalent of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. There was no unified supreme headquarters that could allocate resources, coordinate strategy, or make binding decisions across service boundaries. Japan went to war against the United States, a nation of 130 million people, with an industrial capacity approximately 10 times its own, with a command structure that could not formally integrate its two primary military services. Every subsequent failure has this institutional flaw somewhere in its ancestry. The internal war games. This is where it gets uncomfortable, and I think it needs to be stated plainly. The IJN conducted formal tabletop strategic exercises in 1940 and 1941 that repeatedly produced the same outcome. Japan loses any Pacific conflict that extends beyond approximately 18 months. The post-war testimony of Captain Tatsuwaka Shibuya, recorded in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interview series, confirms that these results were known to senior Naval General Staff officers before the war began. They were not acted upon, they were filed. The institutional culture that had produced the Yamato, the Long Lance, and the Zero could not process information that challenged the Kantai-Kessen premise. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description of how institutional self-censorship operates, not through deliberate fraud, but through the quiet administrative reflex that directs inconvenient conclusions into filing cabinets rather than policy memos. By the 1st of December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had assembled the most powerful combined carrier strike force in naval history. 6 carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, along with 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers, were sailing under radio silence across the North Pacific toward a set of coordinates north of the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The force was designated Kido Butai, Mobile Force. It carried 414 aircraft and the accumulated weight of the Kantai-Kessen philosophy, the belief that one sufficiently devastating blow could end the war before it properly began. What it did not carry, in any meaningful quantity, was a plan for what happened after. The 33 ships of Kido Butai weren't sailing toward a battle. Not really. They were sailing toward the opening argument of an institutional tragedy, a tragedy whose ending was already written in the footnotes of a 1936 budget document that nobody thought to read carefully enough. Kido Butai, the fist that opened the war. The log entry for the 26th of November, 1941, aboard the carrier Akagi, the flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, is extraordinary in its restraint. All ships in order, weather foul, course set. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 33 ships in total, 414 aircraft, and the entry runs to 11 words. There is something in that compressed, administrative terseness that tells you a great deal about the culture that produced it. A culture of professional precision, of performing extraordinary things without particular emphasis. The crew of the Akagi knew what they were doing. Nagumo knew what he was doing. The 11 words were enough. What I want to focus on is not the attack itself, which has been documented more thoroughly than almost any military operation in history, but the things about it that don't fit the triumphalist narrative. Because there are several, and they matter more than the famous parts. The attack on Pearl Harbor was tactically stunning. It was also, in specific and measurable ways, strategically incomplete in a manner that its planners either failed to anticipate or chose not to address. Understanding those gaps is the only way to understand why December 7th, 1941 was the beginning of Japan's defeat, rather than the beginning of Japan's victory. Start with the aircraft. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first wave, 183 aircraft in total, and the signal for his strike leaders was 2 Black Dragon smoke rockets from his own aircraft, meaning surprise had been achieved. But here is a detail from Fuchida's own memoir, co-written with Masatake Okumiya and published in 1951, that appears in almost no documentary treatment of this battle. Fuchida fired 1 smoke rocket, intending the single rocket signal that would have directed his torpedo bomber squadrons into a specific formation reserved for expected opposition. The observers on the surrounding aircraft interpreted the single rocket as 2, triggering a different formation sequence. The first shots of the Pacific War were conducted under a misread signal. The most meticulously planned naval attack in Japanese history began with a communications error. Both the documented facts and the human reality coexist here without comfortable resolution. The attack itself, running from approximately 07:55 to 09:45 on the morning of the 7th of December, was executed with a precision that remains striking even 8 decades later. The modified Type 91 aerial torpedoes, which I mentioned in the last chapter, with their specially designed wooden stabilizer fins for the 40-foot depth constraint of Pearl Harbor's anchorage, modifications completed at the Yokosuka Arsenal only 6 weeks before the attack, performed as designed. 8 American battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. Approximately 3,500 American service personnel were killed. The harbor installations were struck with considerable accuracy. And then the attack ended, and Nagumo's fleet turned northwest, and the decisive strategic failure became visible in the wreckage. 3 American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that morning. The Lexington was at sea, delivering marine aircraft to Midway Island. The Enterprise had departed Pearl Harbor on a routine resupply run to Wake Island 48 hours earlier. The Saratoga was undergoing refit on the American West Coast. Most accounts describe their absence as bad luck for Japan. The carriers happened to be elsewhere. This framing is convenient, but not entirely honest. Nagumo's intelligence staff had updated their assessment of American carrier positions as recently as the 5th of December. The Enterprise's departure was known. The carriers were not struck because they were not the primary target of the operation. The primary targets were the battleships of the Pacific Fleet's battle line, the weapons system that Canty-Kesson Doctrine designated as the decisive force in any fleet engagement. The carriers were operationally significant, but they weren't the battleships. Nagumo's decision not to launch a third strike, declining to attack the Pearl Harbor fuel depot and submarine base, has been debated endlessly since 1941, and the debate is genuinely unresolved. Fuchida wrote in his memoir that he personally argued for a third wave targeting the fuel and submarine infrastructure and was overruled by a cautious Nagumo concerned about American counterattack from the missing carriers. The fuel depot he was referring to contained approximately 4.5 million barrels of Pacific Fleet bunker oil, stored in large, largely unprotected, above-ground tanks on the shore of Oahu. Gordon Prange's exhaustive reconstruction in his book, At Dawn We Slept, drawing on interviews with surviving Kido Butai staff officers, found no evidence that a formal third strike recommendation was submitted to Nagumo as a written tactical proposal. Fuchida's memoir account may be accurate. It may also be the reconstruction of a man with powerful incentives to position himself as the officer who could have won the war. What is not disputed, the submarine base and the fuel depot survived December the 7th intact. Admiral Halsey, in subsequent statements, identified the survival of the fuel depot as the single decision that kept the Pacific Fleet operationally capable through 1942. Whether this was a decision Nagumo made, or a failure Fuchida didn't successfully advocate against, the consequence was the same. The Pacific Fleet's ability to sortie, to resupply, to return to the fight, was preserved by what didn't happen on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941. There is another element of the attack that is almost never discussed in popular treatments, and it matters. The 5 Japanese midget submarines launched as part of the Pearl Harbor operation. 2-man vessels intended to penetrate the harbor and torpedo ships from below during the air attack accomplished nothing. All 5 were lost, without confirmed kills. More importantly, the destroyer USS Ward detected and sank one of the midget submarines at 06:37 in the morning, more than an hour before the air attack began, and reported the contact to Pacific Fleet headquarters. The report was received and processed. The appropriate alarms were not triggered in time. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not, technically, a complete surprise. It was a surprise that the American command apparatus failed to process and respond to within the available window. This distinction doesn't diminish the catastrophe of what followed, but it complicates the mythology considerably. Of the 8 battleships attacked, 6 returned to service before the war ended. The 2 that didn't, the Arizona and the Oklahoma, were both pre-Washington naval treaty ships of 1916 vintage, already candidates for reassessment in any modernization review. Japan had expended strategic surprise, an asset that could be spent exactly once, primarily to sink 2 ships that were arguably approaching the end of their operational lives in an era of carrier aviation. The arithmetic was uncomfortable. The 31 aircraft Kido Butai lost in the attack, and the 29 men killed, were measured losses against an operation the Naval General Staff considered a decisive opening blow. What wasn't measured, because the IJN had no framework for measuring it, was the American institutional response. The attack galvanized a political and industrial mobilization of a scale and speed that the pre-war IJN had not modeled with any seriousness. Kido Butai turned back toward Japan in the pre-dawn hours of December the 8th. The after-action reports were filed. The losses were tallied. The victory was declared. And in Hawaii, in the still smoking naval yards of Pearl Harbor, the fuel tanks that Nagumo hadn't struck were being assessed for damage they had not received. The Empire at high water. Between the 8th of December 1941 and the 8th of May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army executed the most geographically ambitious military conquest in modern history. In 152 days, they seized Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and a vast arc of Pacific Island territories stretching from Wake Island in the east to the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. The scale of it is almost impossible to render adequately in language. The conquered territories covered more total area than the continental United States. The speed was extraordinary. The cost, in Japanese casualties, was comparatively low, and almost none of the strategic benefits materialized in the way that had been planned. Let me give you a sense of what this looked like from the receiving end, because that perspective is usually missing, and it changes the story in important ways. The Royal Netherlands Navy's after-action report on the Battle of the Java Sea, filed by surviving officers who had retreated to Ceylon after the defeat, uses a phrase I have not encountered in any other naval document from this entire war. The enemy, they wrote, appeared to be invulnerable. This was not defeatism. These were professional sailors, trained in the same European naval tradition that had produced the Royal Navy, the French Marine Nationale, and the United States Navy. They had just watched a combined Allied fleet, Dutch, British, Australian, and American ships fighting together under a unified command, systematically destroyed by Japanese cruisers and destroyers that never appeared to close within the range their opponents expected. They had never seen anything like the Long Lance torpedo. They had no conceptual framework for a weapon that could be fired from well outside visual range and strike without warning. The phrase, appeared to be invulnerable, was not hyperbole. It was a clinical observation from professionals who'd been hit by something they couldn't explain. The first concrete demonstration that this era of naval warfare was fundamentally different from everything that had come before came on the 10th of December, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, in the South China Sea. The Royal Navy battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse, dispatched to Singapore as a deterrent force under Admiral Tom Phillips, without air cover because no fighter aircraft with sufficient range were available, were intercepted by land-based Japanese bombers from the 22nd Air Flotilla, operating out of airfields in southern Indochina. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. Both ships were sunk. 840 British sailors died. It was the first time in naval history that capital ships underway and actively maneuvering at sea had been sunk solely by air power, without a single surface ship involved. The admirals of every navy in the world who were paying attention understood what this meant. The battleship era was over. The carrier era had been announced in the South China Sea. On the 11th of January 1942, Japanese forces landed on Tarakan Island off the northeastern coast of Borneo, the island whose oil fields had been one of the primary strategic justifications for the entire war. The Dutch garrison, numbering a few hundred men, fought briefly and then surrendered. Before surrendering, following orders that had been prepared well in advance, they destroyed the oil infrastructure. All 700 oil wells on the island were demolished. Tarakan's Pomoesian and Joata fields had produced approximately 6 million barrels of oil annually in peacetime. In 1942, under Japanese occupation and intensive reconstruction effort, they produced a fraction of that. The oil that Japan had gone to war to seize was rubble when they arrived. This pattern, strategic resource targets systematically demolished before Japanese forces could secure them, repeated itself across the Dutch East Indies campaign. In Borneo, in Sumatra, in Java. The Dutch colonial administration had prepared their demolition plans carefully. They weren't always successful. The Palembang refineries in Sumatra were seized largely intact through an audacious parachute assault on the 12th of February 1942. And that was a genuine strategic windfall for Japan. But the overall picture across the Dutch East Indies in 1942 was of an oil empire delivering approximately 13% of its theoretical yield, at a moment when the Japanese war machine required it to deliver everything immediately. Japan had started a war for oil it would spend the next 2 years trying to repair. The Indian Ocean raid of April 1942, Kido Butai striking Ceylon and sinking the carrier Hermes along with 2 Royal Navy cruisers displayed the same troubling pattern I've been tracking since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Sir James Somerville's Eastern Fleet, which could have been caught in Colombo Harbor and devastated, was at sea when Nagumo struck. Intelligence had warned Somerville of the approaching Japanese force. The Eastern Fleet survived. It was the 3rd time in approximately 4 months that Nagumo's force had allowed a carrier or carrier fleet to escape because the specific timing of intelligence, operational orders, and geographic position didn't align. At Pearl Harbor, the American carriers were simply elsewhere. At the Indian Ocean, the British carriers were warned in time. A pattern of missed opportunities was accumulating, but the winds were so overwhelming that the pattern was invisible. I want to dwell on a specific communications failure that almost nobody mentions when discussing the Indian Ocean raid, because it illustrates something important about how institutional confidence can become operational carelessness. During the raid on Colombo and Trincomalee, IJN reconnaissance aircraft actually located Somerville's main Eastern Fleet at sea, a contact that, if acted upon immediately, might have resulted in a decisive engagement that would have ended British naval power in the Indian Ocean for years. The sighting report was delayed by the standard IJN radio encoding protocol, a process that required the message to be encoded in the fleet cipher before transmission. By the time the decoded report reached Nagumo's flagship, approximately 2 hours and 47 minutes had elapsed since the original observation. Somerville had changed course. The Eastern Fleet survived not through superior seamanship, but because the Japanese radio encoding procedure had a built-in latency of nearly 3 hours that nobody had identified as a critical operational vulnerability. A bureaucratic communication delay preserved British power in the Indian Ocean. What the 5-month conquest produced was a problem that the Naval General Staff had no doctrine for solving: a perimeter. Japan now held an enormous arc of territory stretching from Burma in the west to the Gilbert Islands in the east, and from the Aleutians in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south. Defending that perimeter required the IJN to be strong everywhere simultaneously. The IJN was built to be decisive somewhere specific. The contradiction between the demands of empire and the capabilities of a fleet designed for a single decisive engagement would take years to fully manifest. In the spring of 1942, with the rising sun flag flying from Singapore to Wake Island, the contradiction was invisible. The victories were too large, the losses too small, the momentum too overwhelming for anyone to stop and ask the question the 1936 budget document should have made obvious. What do we do after this? The Coral Sea, the first time the sky fought back. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942 is almost always treated as a prelude, the warm-up act before the main event at Midway a month later. This framing is convenient for narrative purposes and almost entirely wrong as historical analysis. The Coral Sea is not a prelude to anything. It is a battle in which the Imperial Japanese Navy learned something new about itself, specifically that its carrier air groups bled at rates they could not sustain, and then chose not to fully absorb that lesson. The consequences of that choice were paid at Midway, and the specific mechanism by which they were paid has never been adequately explained in most documentary treatments. Start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the story actually lives. The IJN committed its 5th Carrier Division, the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, to the Coral Sea operation in early May of 1942. The 2 ships entered the operation with approximately 127 carrier aircraft between them, flown by air groups that represented some of the most experienced carrier aviation in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the early Pacific sweeps. On the 7th of May, they participated in the sinking of the light carrier Shoho. On the 8th, they executed a major strike against the American carrier force, hitting and seriously damaging the Lexington, which would later sink from internal explosions, and scoring a single bomb hit on the Yorktown. When the shooting stopped and the two Japanese carriers turned for home, 46 of the original 69 aircraft committed to the major strike on the 8th had returned. Of those 46, approximately a dozen were so badly damaged they were pushed over the flight deck edge to make room for serviceable aircraft. The post-battle report to Combined Fleet Headquarters described this as acceptable operational attrition. That word, acceptable, is doing an enormous amount of work in a very small space. The IJN lost approximately 77 aircraft across the entire Coral Sea operation. The official figure, though the United States Strategic Bombing Survey analysis, puts the number somewhere between 77 and 92, depending on how maintenance write-offs are counted. The discrepancy matters less than the category breakdown that neither Japanese official figure addresses. How many of those pilots were from the pre-war trained cohort, the 800-hour professionals, and how many were trainees who had been assigned to fleet units in the preceding months? I have found no Japanese primary source from 1942 that quantifies the loss of pre-war trained carrier pilots as a distinct category. This isn't an oversight. The IJN's leadership structure had built no mechanism for tracking this specific form of attrition, because the Kantai-Kessen Doctrine assumed a short war in which the training pipeline's long-term capacity was irrelevant. The Shikaku's damage was real and significant. 3 bomb hits had torn up her forward flight deck and caused structural damage requiring approximately 2 months of repair at Kure. She would miss Midway. But the Zuikaku's situation was different and more revealing. Her hull was entirely undamaged. Her engines were functioning normally. Her flight deck was intact. She was classified as non-operational for the Midway operation solely because her air group had been so badly depleted that she didn't have sufficient experienced aircraft and crews to function as an independent strike carrier. Approximately 80 replacement aircraft, serviceable planes without experienced pilots, sat at Japanese naval air stations within ferry range of Zuikaku's berth at Truk. Combined fleet staff chose not to assign them and deploy her to Midway on the grounds that her air group lacked cohesion. It was a professionally defensible judgment. It was also the decision that gave the United States Navy a fighting chance at Midway by ensuring that the Japanese carrier force at that battle would have 4 carriers rather than potentially 5 or 6. What is perhaps most revealing about the Coral Sea is the American carrier that survived it and what happened next. The Yorktown absorbed a single bomb hit on the 8th of May that caused significant structural and internal damage. American damage control teams worked on her through the withdrawal from the Coral Sea. She arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May, 3 days before the Midway operation was scheduled to begin, with preliminary Naval Yard estimates suggesting approximately 90 days of repairs were required to restore her to full operational condition. Admiral Nimitz, standing on the dry dock looking at the damage assessment, ordered repairs completed in 72 hours. She sailed for Midway on the 30th of May, her flight deck patched with fresh concrete, her engineering spaces still showing evidence of the Coral Sea damage. She was, by any reasonable technical standard, not fully combat ready. She was also the carrier that provided the air group that found and bombed the Soryu at Midway. I want to address a source conflict that I find genuinely unresolved because the uncertainty matters. The IJN's post-battle operational summary reported 77 aircraft lost across the Coral Sea operation. The JNAC analysis, the Joint Army-Navy Committee that compiled comprehensive Japanese loss records after the war, produced a figure of between 77 and 92, depending on accounting methodology for maintenance write-offs and aircraft pushed overboard. These are different source types. The IJN summary was compiled within days of the battle, under operational pressure, by officers who had strong institutional incentives to minimize the scale of losses. The JNAC figure was compiled years after the war, with access to records the operational staff didn't have time to cross-reference. Neither is definitive. What both agree on is that the 5th Carrier Division exited the Coral Sea with a combat-ready air group strength of approximately 36% of its pre-battle complement. 36%. The ships were classified as operational based on hull integrity, not air group strength, because the IJN's administrative definition of operational specified the former but not the latter. This is the bureaucratic gap at the center of the story. A carrier with an intact flight deck but a shattered air group is an operational vessel by IJN administrative standard and a combat liability by operational reality. Both things are simultaneously true, and the IJN's command structure only had a mechanism for measuring one of them. The battle that didn't happen matters almost as much as the one that did. The Port Moresby invasion force, which the entire Coral Sea operation had been designed to cover, turned back on the 9th of May, when Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue concluded that proceeding without carrier support was no longer viable. It was the first time in the Pacific War that a Japanese amphibious operation had been strategically defeated before it put soldiers ashore. The carrier that forced that cancellation, the Yorktown, with her patched concrete flight deck and her exhausted damage control teams, would be at Midway in 28 days. The Coral Sea didn't look like a turning point. Japan had, by the conventional accounting, won on points. One fleet carrier sunk on each side, the Americans having lost the Lexington against Japan's smaller Shoho. The IJN reported it as a tactical success and filed the air group attrition figures in the category of acceptable operational costs. What they had actually done was trade irreplaceable pilots for replaceable ships at the precise moment in the war when the pipeline for producing irreplaceable pilots was already strained by 18 months of intensive operations. The arithmetic was running against them. The ledger just hadn't been read yet. 4 minutes at Midway, the pivot of everything. I want to start not with the battle, but with the deception that made it possible, because without the deception, there is no Midway as history knows it. In the spring of 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalytic unit at Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo, operating in a basement described by its occupants as a dungeon, had been working to break the Japanese naval cipher designated JN-25B. They'd achieved partial success, enough to read approximately 40% of intercepted traffic, and what they were reading suggested a major Japanese offensive operation being planned against a target designated in communications only as AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Island. His superiors in naval intelligence in Washington believed it was the Aleutians, or possibly the American West Coast. The disagreement was fundamental, and the entire strategic response to the coming operation hung on which interpretation was correct. Rochefort's team devised a solution of elegant simplicity. They sent an uncoded radio message from Midway Island, in a channel known to be monitored by Japanese signals intelligence, reporting a problem with the island's water distillation equipment. Within days, Japanese naval communications traffic in the JN-25B cipher included a reference to an AF water shortage. The deception worked because the Japanese signals intelligence analysts were professional enough to relay accurate information and confident enough in their own cipher's security not to question why an American base would broadcast infrastructure problems in the clear. The operational security for the largest Japanese offensive since Pearl Harbor was defeated by a fabricated plumbing complaint. That detail should be more famous than it is. The plan Yamamoto had designed for the Midway operation was ambitious in a way that revealed both the IJN's operational creativity and its fundamental strategic blindness. He would send a diversionary force to the Aleutians to draw American attention north, then strike Midway with Kido Butai's 4 carriers. By now the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, minus the Shokaku and Zuikaku still being repaired from Coral Sea damage, to destroy the island's air defenses. The resulting engagement would force the American Pacific Fleet to sortie, at which point Yamamoto's massive main force, including the Yamato and its accompanying battleships, would close in and destroy whatever carriers the Americans brought to the fight. The plan required the American fleet to behave exactly as Yamamoto expected. It required the Midway garrison's air strength to be neutralized before the American carriers arrived. And it required Nagumo's Kido Butai to hold a portion of its strike aircraft in reserve with anti-ship weapons, while simultaneously striking Midway with the other portion. Nagumo's after-action report, the document the Office of Naval Intelligence translated and published in 1947, one of the few surviving primary Japanese accounts of the battle, describes the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, with a clinical precision that, in retrospect, reads like a man documenting his own operational death. He had launched a first strike against Midway. Reports from the returning pilots indicated that a second strike was necessary to properly suppress the island's defenses. He ordered the reserve aircraft, armed with torpedoes for anti-ship use, to be rearmed with bombs for a second land attack mission. This was the decision. Not the only decision, and not the only failure, but the one that happens to have been made at the moment when the context around it was most unforgiving. At 0800, approximately 30 minutes into the rearming sequence, a search aircraft reported sighting American surface ships. At 0809 came the specific report: one carrier. Nagumo now held in his hands the single worst tactical hand a carrier commander can be dealt. Aircraft in mid-rearm, hangar decks cluttered with torpedoes and bombs, fuel lines running to aircraft in various states of preparation, and an enemy carrier within strike range. His carrier force had to recover the returning Midway strike aircraft, rearm and refuel everything, and launch an anti-ship strike, all while conducting air operations in a combat zone. The sequence was, given the aircraft spotted on his radar and the timing of his own flight operations, almost certainly unachievable. He tried anyway. 0:10:22 to 0:10:26, approximately 4 minutes. 3 American dive bomber groups rolled into their attack runs from high altitude, largely unseen because Nagumo's Zero Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down to low altitude over the preceding hours by repeated American torpedo bomber attacks. Attacks that had themselves been almost entirely destroyed by the Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire, at terrible cost to their crews, but which had served the unintended function of keeping the fighter cover low and slow at the exact moment the dauntless dive bombers arrived from above. Whether this was deliberate American coordination, or the operational emergent consequence of multiple unrelated attack groups following their own target solutions, is a historiographical debate that remains genuinely open. Both explanations have supporting evidence. The dive bombers attacked, regardless of why the sky above them was clear. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were each struck within those 4 minutes. The flight decks themselves were not the critical vulnerability. Bombs penetrating a carrier's wooden deck were serious, but not necessarily fatal. What made these carriers different was the state of their hangar decks. Aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs, fuel lines running hot, ordnance stacked in corridors because the formal stowage procedures had been bypassed under time pressure. The 3 carriers burned because they were floating ammunition depots at the moment they were struck, not simply because they were hit by dive bombers. The specific operational context, the rearming sequence, the time pressure, the compromises made in ordnance stowage, turned bomb hits that might have been survivable into catastrophic, uncontrollable fires. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived the initial attack. Her air group launched a counterattack that found and hit the Yorktown, the same carrier, patched with Pearl Harbor concrete, that had fought at the Coral Sea. 2 waves of Hiryu's aircraft hit the Yorktown hard enough to stop her dead in the water. The second wave misidentified a different American carrier as the Yorktown, a navigational and visual confusion understandable under combat conditions, but hit her anyway, causing severe damage. The Yorktown would eventually be sunk, while under tow, by a Japanese submarine 2 days after the main battle. Hiryu herself was found late in the afternoon of the 4th, struck by dive bombers, and burned through the night. Her survivors were taken off by destroyer. She was scuttled by her own crew the following morning, rather than be left as a derelict. Yamamoto, aboard the Yamato, 300 miles to the rear, received the reports of carrier losses across the day of the 4th of June, and briefly considered a night surface engagement. He had a powerful force: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and some portion of his planning instincts pressed for the Kantai-Kessen he had come to execute. But without carrier air cover, his surface force couldn't operate safely within range of Midway's land-based aircraft in daylight. And a night surface engagement against an American fleet that he couldn't precisely locate, whose composition and position he didn't fully know, was not the decisive fleet battle the Doctrine promised. It was a gamble in darkness. He turned west. It was the first time the combined fleet had retreated in this war. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, totaling approximately 102,000 tons of displacement. More critically, and more permanently, it lost approximately 248 aircraft and a number of highly trained carrier aviators that is genuinely uncertain because Japanese records are incomplete and the post-war accounting was never fully reconciled. The United States lost the Yorktown and approximately 150 aircraft. By the tonnage metric and the ship count, the losses were asymmetric in the extreme. By the pilot experience metric, the metric the IJN had no institutional framework for measuring, they were catastrophic for Japan, in a way that wouldn't become fully visible for another year, when the replacement pilots arrived in fleet units with 250 hours in their logbooks instead of 800. Midway wasn't a miracle. It was a probability. The probability that accumulated from suppressed wargame results, from Zuikaku's missing air group, from a plumbing deception in a radio message, from 4.5 million barrels of fuel that survived December the 7th intact, from a zero combat air patrol drawn low by torpedo bombers whose crews knew they were flying into fire. History tends to reach for the word miracle when multiple improbable things align to produce an outcome that changed everything. What actually happened at Midway was the convergence of Japanese structural failures and American structural advantages, arriving at the same coordinates at the same time. The 4 minutes were the result. They weren't the cause. The Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal, and the Bleeding War. There is a sentence in Admiral Raizo Tanaka's account of the Guadalcanal campaign, published in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings in 1956, the most operationally detailed Japanese naval memoir of the campaign available in English, that has stayed with me since the first time I read it. He is describing the Tokyo Express supply runs to Guadalcanal, the destroyer convoys that ran from the Shortland Islands down the slot and back under cover of darkness, carrying food and ammunition to Japanese forces on the island, who were running out of both. "We were running our destroyers to Guadalcanal so frequently," he wrote, "that the crews had no time for maintenance. The boiler rooms were running hot, and the men were sleeping in 4-hour shifts." He wrote this more than a decade after the battle. That he remembered the 4-hour sleep shifts specifically, above all other details, above tactics and losses and victories, tells you something that no operational summary can. Guadalcanal is a 6-month campaign involving more than 20 distinct naval engagements, 7 of them major enough to receive individual names in the historical record. I'm not going to summarize them all. What I am going to do is something more useful. Explain what Guadalcanal cost the IJN in destroyers, because the destroyer losses are where the strategic arithmetic breaks down, in the most concrete, measurable, and irreversible way. The destroyer was the IJN's most operationally versatile hull type: torpedo attack, anti-aircraft screening, logistics support, submarine hunting. and Guadalcanal consumed them with a steadiness that the Naval General Staff's battle-focused planning never adequately modelled. On the night of the 8th and 9th of August, 1942, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a force of 5 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers in a night surface attack on the Allied naval force protecting the American landings at Guadalcanal. The result was the Battle of Savo Island, and it was, by any professional measure, one of the most decisive naval tactical victories of the entire Pacific War. 4 Allied cruisers, the American Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria, and the Australian Canberra, were sunk in less than 40 minutes. Approximately 1,077 Allied sailors died. Mikawa lost no ships. It was the worst American naval defeat in a surface engagement since the War of 1812. Mikawa then turned his force around and sailed back north without attacking the American transport fleet, which was sitting undefended and unloading troops and supplies at Guadalcanal. The transports he left intact would supply the Marines who held the island for the next 6 months. Why Mikawa didn't press the attack on the transports is a source conflict that the historical record has never fully resolved. His official dispatch cited the risk of American air attack after dawn, a reasonable professional concern given the aircraft on Henderson Field and the approaching morning. Some post-war analysts have suggested he was simply unaware of how exposed the transport fleet was. Tanaka, writing from experience of the campaign's later phases, implied in his memoir that the decision reflected a fundamental institutional reflex. The IJN had trained its surface forces to engage and destroy enemy warships, and the concept of prioritizing soft logistic targets over tactical surface opponents required a mental reorientation that Mikawa's planning didn't accommodate. The transports survived. The Marines they delivered held Henderson Field. The campaign settled into attrition. The Tokyo Express supply runs that Tanaka commanded across the autumn of 1942 were a masterpiece of operational execution under impossible conditions. Each convoy ran approximately 10 hours round trip from the Shortland Islands staging area to Guadalcanal and back. The destroyers needed a minimum of 36 hours of maintenance between runs to maintain their boilers and mechanical systems adequately. This meant each individual destroyer was operationally available for approximately 40% of any given week. The supply runs were the only thing keeping the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal alive. They were also, simultaneously, a guarantee that the garrison couldn't be reinforced fast enough or supplied abundantly enough to defeat the Marines holding Henderson Field. It was a system optimized for survival at the expense of victory. On the night of the 13th and 14th of November, 1942, came the engagement that settled the campaign's strategic outcome, though it wasn't recognized as such at the time. The second phase of the naval battle of Guadalcanal brought the American battleships South Dakota and Washington into a night surface engagement against the Japanese battleship Kirishima and her destroyer screen. The Washington's fire control radar tracked and engaged the Kirishima at ranges beyond comfortable visual identification, achieving multiple heavy hits that forced the battleship's abandonment and scuttling. It was the first time in the Pacific War that radar-directed gunfire had been the decisive factor in a major surface engagement. The IJN's fire control systems, the Type 22 radar, introduced in 1942, provided useful contact ranges of approximately 8 to 10,000 yards. The American SG radar, installed on cruisers and destroyers by mid-1942, provided reliable contact resolution at ranges up to 22,000 yards. The night surface battle, Japan's tactical specialty, the domain in which years of intense pre-war training had given its sailors a genuine advantage, had become a zone of American technological superiority. Tanaka's Battle of Tassafaronga on the 30th of November 1942 is one of those engagements that occupies a genuinely awkward historiographical position. By the tactical accounting, it was an IJN victory. Tanaka's destroyer force, caught while on a supply run and under immediate attack by a superior American cruiser force, executed torpedo salvos with such speed and precision that they sank one American heavy cruiser and damaged 4 others, while losing only 1 Japanese destroyer. Samuel Eliot Morison, in his official U.S. naval history, called it one of the most humiliating defeats in American naval history. Tanaka, in his memoir, called it something quite different, a meaningless success. His supply canisters, the entire operational reason his destroyers were in those waters, were never recovered by Japanese forces on shore. The canisters were dropped on schedule. The garrison was too weak and too disorganized to retrieve them from the water in the dark. He won the battle and failed the mission, and he was clear-eyed enough to understand the difference. The evacuation of Guadalcanal in early February of 1943, Operation KE, is the most competently executed IJN operation of the entire campaign, and it is a retreat. 3 nights of destroyer runs extracted 10,652 Japanese troops from the island, undetected by American intelligence, which had been told by its analysts to expect a reinforcement run rather than an evacuation. The 29 Japanese ships committed to the evacuation lost nothing. It was an operational achievement of real distinction, and 24,000 Japanese soldiers had already died on the island. Approximately 8,500 killed in combat, the remainder dead from disease and starvation in the island's malaria-ridden jungles, before the evacuation made the survivors' survival possible. The 6-month Guadalcanal naval campaign cost the IJN 29 major warships, including 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The 11 destroyers deserve specific attention. Each Fubuki-class destroyer required approximately 18 months to construct and carried a crew of approximately 197 sailors. The 11 destroyers lost at Guadalcanal represented roughly 18 months of production time per hull, multiplied by 11 hulls, and approximately 2,100 experienced destroyer crewmen killed or taken prisoner. Japan's naval shipyards were building approximately 6 destroyers per year at this stage of the war. Guadalcanal had consumed roughly 33 months of destroyer production in 6 months of fighting. The gap between production rate and consumption rate was not something anyone in the Naval General Staff had modelled. The Kantai-Kessen Doctrine didn't have a variable for destroyer attrition in a sustained logistics war, because the Kantai-Kessen Doctrine didn't have a variable for sustained logistics wars. The Iron Bottom Sound, the name that sailors of both navies gave to the waters north of Guadalcanal, named for the accumulation of wrecks on its floor, contains, by post-war sonar survey, approximately 38 major wrecks, roughly half Japanese, roughly half American. The statistical symmetry conceals the strategic asymmetry completely. Every American ship sunk was replaced within months, most within weeks, by the output of shipyards running around the clock across a continent that was entirely beyond the reach of Japanese attack. 0 Japanese capital ships were replaced in the Pacific order of battle during the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The Iron Bottom Sound looks, in the wreck count, like a war fought between equals. It wasn't. It was a war fought between a nation that could rebuild what it lost and a nation that couldn't. And the wrecks on the ocean floor don't show you which was which. The machine that couldn't feed itself. IJN Logistics and the Oil Paradox. There is a table in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey report titled Oil in Japan's War, published in 1946, that I consider the single most clarifying document in the entire Pacific War archive. It is not dramatic. It contains no battles, no admirals, no moments of decision. It is a production ledger, columns of figures tracking Japanese oil reserves, tanker tonnage, refinery output, and fleet fuel consumption across 4 years of war. And what it shows, with the flat indifference of arithmetic, is that Japan's strategic situation was not merely difficult by mid-1944. It was, in a specific and measurable sense, already over. The fleet existed. The fuel to operate it was disappearing at a rate that no operational success could reverse. Japan entered the Pacific War with strategic oil reserves of approximately 9.4 million kiloliters, a figure the US SBS team calculated from Japanese Ministry of Munitions records that had survived the post-surrender document destruction. At the IJN's wartime operational consumption rate, those reserves would last approximately 3.5 years. The Dutch East Indies oil fields the war had been launched to capture could, in theory, extend that timeline considerably. The fields at Palembang in Sumatra, at Balikpapan in Borneo, at Tarakan, had collectively produced approximately 8 million tons of oil annually in the late 1930s. In theory. But the Dutch demolition teams had done their work thoroughly. Actual Japanese oil extraction from the Dutch East Indies in all of 1942, the first full year of occupation, totaled approximately 1.16 million tons. The theoretical yield was 8 million. The actual yield was 1.16. Japan had started a war for an oil empire that was delivering roughly 14% of its promised output in its first operational year, against a fleet that had been designed to run at full throttle. The recovery effort across 1943 was real and significant. Actual Dutch East Indies oil production climbed to approximately 2.49 million tons. But it never approached the pre-war productive capacity, partly because the Dutch sabotage had been thorough, partly because the specialized refinery equipment required to process Borneo's high paraffin crude couldn't be manufactured in Japan fast enough to replace what had been destroyed. Here is a technical detail that almost never appears in popular histories of this campaign. The crude oil from Borneo's primary fields had a substantially higher paraffin content than the crude the Japanese military refineries had been designed to process. Refining it to usable naval fuel oil required thermal cracking at temperatures above 400 degrees Celsius, a process that many IJN military refineries were not equipped to perform as late as 1943. A significant proportion of captured Borneo crude was therefore burned directly in ship boilers without full refining, as what engineers called Tarakan crude, a practice that left waxy paraffin deposits on boiler heat exchange surfaces, reducing thermal efficiency by roughly 12 to 18% and requiring more frequent maintenance stops. The oil Japan was fighting to secure was degrading the mechanical performance of the ships fighting to secure it. There is a specific and bitter irony in that fact. While Japan was struggling to extract and process the oil it had captured, American submarines were systematically attacking the tanker fleet required to move that oil to where the fleet could use it. The campaign against Japanese shipping is one of the most consequential and least celebrated strategic operations of the entire Second World War. Approximately 250 American submarines, operating primarily from Pearl Harbor, Fremantle in Australia, and later from advanced bases across the Central Pacific, sank 170 Japanese tankers by the end of 1944, totaling approximately 686,000 gross tons. Japan's total tanker fleet at the start of the war had numbered approximately 586 vessels. By mid-1944, effective tanker tonnage available for oil transport had declined by nearly 60%. The oil was in the ground in Borneo. The ships to move it were on the ocean floor of the South China Sea, the Philippine Sea, and the waters of the Western Pacific. The strategic consequence of this was the decision that I find most clarifying about the IJN's true condition by the summer of 1944. A decision that is mentioned in most histories as a logistical footnote and should be treated as a strategic tombstone. Admiral Soemu Toyoda based the IJN's main surface battle fleet, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's 1st Diversion Attack Force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan still possessed, at Linga Roads, an anchorage near Singapore, rather than at Japanese home waters. The official reason was proximity to oil. The fleet could not be fueled in Japan and then sent to fight in the Philippines in return. The tanker tonnage for the round trip no longer existed. So the fleet had to live adjacent to its fuel supply, thousands of miles from the home islands, unable to train its crews in Japanese waters, unable to draw on Japanese repair infrastructure, unable to maintain the integration with naval air forces that any coherent fleet operation required. A fleet anchored next to its fuel because it cannot move without running dry is not a strategic asset. It is a strategic problem wearing the appearance of a strategic asset. Japan had, by 1944, created a paradox with no clean solution. The fleet needed fuel to fight. Without fighting, the Philippines would fall and the oil supply routes would be cut. With fighting, the fleet would consume the fuel it needed to survive subsequent operations. And the tanker losses meant that even a successful battle couldn't guarantee reliable subsequent resupply. Toyota understood this. His post-war testimony in the US SBS interview series, interview number 62, conducted in October of 1945, contains some of the most lucid strategic self-assessment in the entire Japanese archive. He had been aware of potential oil crisis conditions as early as mid-1943, he stated, and had requested emergency tanker construction. Combined fleet records show no emergency tanker program was approved in response to that request. The gap between Toyota's stated awareness and the absence of corresponding institutional action is one of the most troubling documentary discrepancies in the entire archive. A senior commander who saw the crisis coming asked for the tools to address it and received nothing. The final data point in this chapter is the one that brings everything into proportion. The USSBS, War Against Japanese Transportation Report, contains production figures for American and Japanese shipbuilding during the war years that I want to state without editorial comment, because they don't require any. In 1941, Japanese shipyards produced approximately 236,000 tons of new warship construction. In 1944, 3 years into a desperate war, with every shipyard working at maximum stated capacity, Japanese shipyards produced approximately 196,000 tons, less than 1941. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese industrial capacity had, by 1944, reduced naval construction output below the pre-war peacetime baseline, even as operational losses were running at 5 times the pre-war rate. The mathematics of that relationship, declining production against accelerating losses, didn't require a grand strategic vision to understand. It required only a functioning calculator and the willingness to read what the numbers were saying. Operation Tengo, in April of 1945, sent the Yamato to Okinawa with 2,500 tons of bunker fuel, approximately 40% of her 6,300-ton capacity. Reserve fuel at Kure Naval Base had fallen to 65,000 tons. 10 days of fleet operations. For all the drama of that final voyage, the fuel allocation tells the story more completely than any battle account. Japan's largest warship, the most heavily armed battleship ever constructed by any nation, sailed toward its last battle with its fuel tanks 60% empty because the fuel to fill them wasn't there. The Zero's obsolescence, when excellence became a liabit. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Staff issued a specification for a new carrier-based fighter that Jiro Horikoshi, the chief designer assigned to meet it, described in his memoir as sitting at the extreme boundary of what aerodynamics currently permitted. The specification demanded simultaneously a maximum speed exceeding 500 kilometers per hour, a combat radius exceeding 1,600 kilometers with drop tanks, a climb rate of 3,000 meters in 3.5 minutes, and maneuverability superior to any existing fighter in the world. Meeting all four requirements with the engine technology available in 1937 was not straightforward. It was, by Horikoshi's own assessment, almost impossible. He met every specification. To do so, he accepted structural compromises that were rational in 1937 and lethal by 1943. And the story of how those compromises moved from engineering trade-off to operational catastrophe is one of the most precise case studies in the danger of optimizing for the present at the expense of the future. The critical compromise was the structural safety factor. Standard naval aircraft specifications required a design that could withstand loading forces of at least 3 gravities, 3 times the aircraft's own weight, without structural failure, providing a safety margin for combat maneuvering, turbulence, and the unplanned stresses of carrier operations. Horikoshi achieved the A6M's extraordinary combination of range, speed, and maneuverability by accepting a structural safety factor of 1.8 gravities, less than 2/3 of the standard specification. He was explicit about this in his design calculations. The Naval Air Staff accepted it. The decision prioritized range and agility, the qualities that made the Zero what it was, over the structural reserve that might have allowed it to evolve. It was an engineering choice made rationally, in a specific context, for specific reasons. By 1943, that choice had become a kind of structural sentence. In the summer of 1942, a Japanese A6M2 pilot participating in the Dutch harbour raid in the Aleutians was hit by anti-aircraft fire, wounded, and made a forced landing wheels down on the flat tundra of Akutan Island. He died, almost certainly of his wounds, without having destroyed his aircraft. The Zero was recovered largely intact by an American recovery team, transported to Naval Air Station North Island at San Diego, repaired sufficiently for flight, and put through a systematic evaluation against available American fighters. The formal evaluation report, produced by the Naval Air Technical Intelligence Center, made specific findings about the Zero's performance envelope that were immediately incorporated into American fighter training doctrine. American pilots were told, "Do not engage a Zero in a low-speed turning fight. Dive through, use your structural strength, climb away." The Zero's control surfaces became heavy and ineffective at speeds above approximately 300 kilometers per hour. The ailerons required forces that made rapid maneuvering extremely difficult at high speed, a characteristic of its light construction that Horikoshi acknowledged in technical terms, but which had not been operationally relevant when Zero pilots were fighting opponents who didn't know about it. Japan had just lost its greatest tactical secret to a forced landing on Alaskan tundra. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, the F-6F Hellcat had been in Pacific service for approximately 8 months. Designed by Grumman specifically in response to combat reports about Zero encounters, the company's engineering team studied every available account of Zero performance and specifically engineered around its known characteristics. The Hellcat weighed approximately 7,025 kilograms loaded, more than twice the Zero's 2,733 kilograms. Its structural limit was 9 gravities. Its Pratt & Whitney R2-800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, compared with the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine producing approximately 940 horsepower in its later variants. The Hellcat was not designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed so that turning fights wouldn't be necessary. I want to give you a specific technical picture of what the Zero's armament situation looked like by 1944, because it matters and it's almost never explained adequately. The A6M's armament consisted of 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns. The cannon, with a standard drum holding 60 rounds per gun, could fire for approximately 8 seconds at standard rate before ammunition exhaustion. 8 seconds. Japanese pilots were trained, as a consequence of this ammunition constraint, to wait for close-range certainty before pressing the firing trigger. A firing discipline that worked brilliantly when Japanese pilots had 800 hours of flight time and were engaging surprised or less experienced opponents. And that became progressively untenable as American fighter direction officers began vectoring multiple F-6F Hellcats onto individual Zeros simultaneously. You cannot choose your optimal firing moment when 3 aircraft are attacking you from different angles. The 8-second cannon budget was designed for a duel. The Pacific Air War of 1944 was not a duel. The aircraft Japan should have replaced the Zero with, the Mitsubishi A7M Reppu, designed by Horikoshi's team in response to a Naval Air Staff replacement specification issued in 1942, flew its first prototype in May of 1944. By Horikoshi's account, and by the available engineering evaluations, it was a substantially superior aircraft in every category that mattered: speed, structural strength, firepower, and the ability to operate effectively against the F-6F Hellcat in the combat environment of the Central Pacific. It entered fleet service never. Total production by war's end: 8 aircraft. The Mitsubishi factory at Nagoya that was responsible for Reppu production was severely damaged in the American bombing campaign by early 1945, but the production program had already been running more than 2 years behind any schedule that could have mattered operationally before the first bomb fell on Nagoya. The institutional decision not to prioritize the Reppu over continued Zero production, a decision driven partly by the familiarity of the existing design and partly by the ongoing demand for Zero replacements to fill the gaps left by combat losses, was made long before American bombers reached the home islands. Horikoshi knew what he had built, and he knew what it couldn't do. His memoir, published in Japanese in 1956 and translated into English in 1981, is not the work of a man in denial. He writes about the Zero's design trade-offs with a precision that reads like a formal technical defense: careful, specific, prepared for challenge. He is explicit that the 1.8 gravity safety factor was a known compromise, explicit that the performance achieved was at the boundary of possibility, explicit that the aircraft was designed for the tactical environment of its time. What he doesn't quite address, at least not directly, is the institutional decision to keep building the Zero long after the tactical environment it was designed for had ceased to exist. The gap between what Horikoshi designed and what the Naval Air Staff chose to do with his design across 5 years of war, that gap is where the real story lives. The engineer gave the institution a brilliant weapon. The institution didn't replace it in time. Between December of 1941 and August of 1945, Japan produced approximately 10,449 A6M0s in all variants. The United States produced 12,275 F-6F Hellcats between 1943 and 1945 alone, in less than half the Zero's production time frame, during a war being fought simultaneously across 2 hemispheres. Japan's qualitative weapon, built in large numbers across 4 years of desperate effort, was numerically outproduced by a single American replacement program in 24 months. The numbers tell you which industrial system had structural depth and which had been running on reserves since the beginning. Solomons, the ladder they couldn't climb. Admiral Raizo Tanaka records a moment in his memoir of the Guadalcanal and Solomons campaign that I want to set alongside the strategic analysis, because it grounds everything in human reality. Standing on the bridge of his destroyer in the immediate aftermath of a successful torpedo engagement during one of the Solomons surface battles, his executive officer turns to him and says, as Tanaka reconstructs it across more than a decade of memory, "We hit them. Another victory." Tanaka's response, as he gives it, "Yes, And tomorrow we will be back here, and the next day, and there will always be more American ships. Whether this exchange happened with exactly those words, at exactly that moment, is impossible to verify. Memoir reconstruction across a decade is not a transcript, but the sentiment it captures was real, and it was rare. A Japanese flag officer who understood, in the middle of a campaign his navy was arguably winning on points, that the competition he was winning was not the competition that mattered. The Solomons Campaign of 1942 through 1943 is among the most complex sequences of naval operations in the Pacific War, involving more than 50 distinct engagements across 18 months of fighting. The IJN won a substantial number of them. It won by nearly every tactical metric that naval officers use to assess battle outcomes. Ship sunk versus ship sunk. Aircraft destroyed versus aircraft destroyed. Missions completed versus missions failed. And it lost the campaign. Understanding the gap between tactical performance and strategic outcome is the only analytical task that makes the Solomons worth studying at this length. And it's a task that requires looking at what the IJN was actually measuring versus what the campaign was actually deciding. What the campaign was deciding was whether the United States could operate land-based air power from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, and subsequently from a chain of airfields extending northwest through the Solomons toward Rabaul, the great Japanese base at the tip of New Britain. The IJN's surface forces could not destroy an airfield. They could suppress it temporarily, damage runways, force American aircraft to disperse. But as long as American construction battalions could repair runway surfaces in 48 hours, and replacement aircraft could be flown in from carriers and rear bases, the airfields endured. Japan was winning night surface battles to protect a land campaign that the land campaign couldn't win, against an air campaign that the surface battles couldn't stop. The Battle of Cape Esperance, on the night of the 11th and 12th of October, 1942, demonstrated what the new radar-equipped American surface forces could do to the IJN's night fighting specialty. An American cruiser and destroyer force under Rear Admiral Norman Scott intercepted a Japanese supply convoy and its escorts in a night engagement that, by all pre-war Japanese doctrine, should have favored the side that had spent more time training for night fighting. The Americans detected the approaching Japanese force on radar before the Japanese realized they were under observation. The Japanese formation commander, receiving unexpected fire from an unidentified source, ordered a turnaway to assess the situation. The turnaway cost him tactical position and several ships. Tanaka, who analyzed the battle extensively in his memoir, identified the moment of the Japanese turn as the critical failure. In a radar engagement, the instinct to pause and assess is fatal, because the opponent who can see you in the dark doesn't need to pause. Operation Igo, Yamamoto's major air offensive of April 1943, using carrier aircraft flown ashore to supplement land-based strength, is the episode in the Solomons campaign that I find most analytically troubling, because it reveals the degree to which inflated pilot victory claims had begun to corrupt Japanese strategic planning at the highest level. The offensive was declared a significant success based on pilot debriefing reports, claiming the destruction of 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 transports, along with large numbers of aircraft. Post-war analysis of American records showed the actual losses to be 1 tanker, 1 destroyer, 1 additional naval vessel, and approximately 20 to 25 aircraft. The IJN's pilots had claimed approximately 10 times their actual results. This was not unusual. Overclaiming in aerial combat is a universal phenomenon in all air forces during the Second World War, driven by the genuine difficulty of confirming kills in the confusion of air battle. What was unusual was the degree to which the inflated claims were accepted without cross-checking at the command level, and used as the basis for strategic decisions. Yamamoto accepted the Operation Igo results as reported, declared the offensive magnificent, and flew to Bougainville on the 18th of April 1943 to personally congratulate his airmen. The itinerary for this tour had been transmitted in Japanese naval cipher, a cipher that American signals intelligence had broken. 16 Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters from Henderson Field intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville at the scheduled time at the scheduled location. Yamamoto was killed. The specific causality chain, inflated victory reports generating a morale tour whose schedule was intercepted because it was transmitted in a compromised cipher, is documented in the Magic Intercepts declassified in 1977. The commander who built the Pearl Harbor operation and planned Midway died as a consequence of accepting battle damage assessments that his own pilots had inflated by approximately a factor of 10. By the time of the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November of 1943, the IJN's last significant surface action in the Solomons, Tanaka's observation about the futility of tactical victories was being confirmed with brutal consistency. A Japanese surface force sortied to interfere with American landings on Bougainville. The force fought a technically competent engagement against American cruisers and destroyers. It failed to prevent the landings. The Americans went ashore anyway. Tanaka wasn't present at Empress Augusta Bay. He'd been removed from command months earlier after sending a message to the Naval General Staff that was too direct in its criticism of Guadalcanal strategy. But his assessment of the campaign's logic would have applied. They had fought, in his phrase, perfectly and accomplished nothing. The specific attrition of experienced junior officers across the Solomons campaign is a category of loss that the IJN's administrative records tracked inadequately, and that post-war analysis has never fully reconstructed. What is clear, from the fragmentary evidence available, is that the campaign consumed not just aircraft and ships, but the accumulated tactical knowledge of a generation of destroyer captains, torpedo officers, and air group leaders. Promotion came fast in 1942 and 43. Too fast. Men who needed another year of professional development were commanding ships at 26 and 27 because the men who should have commanded them were dead. The resulting force was numerically maintained but qualitatively hollowed, a process that didn't show clearly in the battle reports, because a hollow force can still fight, can still score tactical victories, can still run supply convoys and execute torpedo attacks. What it cannot do is sustain those performances against an opponent that is simultaneously improving its own training, its own technology, and its own numerical strength, at a rate that no amount of Japanese professional courage could match. The ladder of islands running northwest from Guadalcanal toward Rabaul, New Georgia, Colombangara, Vella La Vella, Bougainville, was a ladder Japan was defending step by step, giving ground with each step, while maintaining the tactical discipline to make each step cost the Americans something. The Americans paid the cost. Then they bypassed Rabaul entirely in early 1944, isolating Japan's greatest South Pacific base with its approximately 90,000 troops, and rendering it strategically irrelevant without the costly direct assault that Japanese planners had prepared for. The ladder Japan had been defending at such cost led to a door that the Americans simply went around. The Solomons campaign ended not with a decisive engagement, but with a strategic irrelevance. The Marianas Turkey Shoot. 500 aircraft and an empty sky. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's report on Japanese air power, published in 1946, contains a translated summary of Imperial Japanese Navy aviator training records across the war years that I want to state as plainly as possible, because the numbers do the work that paragraphs of analysis cannot. In 1941, the average Japanese carrier pilot, completing training and receiving a fleet assignment, had accumulated 800 flying hours. By 1943, the accelerated training program implemented after Midway had reduced that figure to approximately 500 hours. By early 1944, the months immediately preceding the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the average newly assigned carrier pilot had approximately 250 flying hours. The American pilot opposing him at the Philippine Sea had approximately 525 hours and had been flying the F-6F Hellcat, specifically engineered to kill the Zero, for at least 6 months of operational service. The battle was not decided in the air over the Philippine Sea on the 19th of June, 1944. It was decided in the training establishments and flight schools of both nations across the preceding 2 years. The operational plan the IJN committed to at the Philippine Sea, Operation AGO, designed by Combined Fleet Headquarters and activated when American forces landed on Saipan on the 15th of June, had a theoretical elegance that the realities of 1944 made almost immediately irrelevant. Japanese carrier aircraft would strike the American Fast Carrier Task Force from ranges beyond American counterstrike capability, exploiting the longer range of Japanese aircraft compared to their American counterparts, then land on the airfields of Guam and Tinian to refuel and rearm, then strike again on the return flight. In concept, this transformed the IJN's carriers into a kind of relay system, extending their effective striking range by using the Marianas airfields as forward refueling points. In practice, it required newly trained pilots with 250 hours to navigate accurately across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean to airfields that were simultaneously under American air attack in aircraft they'd been flying operationally for a matter of months, against a fighter direction system that the IJN had no comparable equivalent to. The first wave launched from Japanese carriers on the morning of the 19th of June consisted of approximately 69 aircraft. American radar aboard the carriers of Task Force 58 detected the incoming formation at a range of approximately 150 miles, giving fighter direction officers more than an hour to vector F-6F Hellcats to altitude and intercept position. What followed in the next several hours has entered history under the name the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a phrase coined by a pilot during a post-engagement debriefing who described the experience as resembling hunting in conditions of easy abundance. The name is accurate as far as it goes. What it doesn't capture is the specific reason the hunting was easy, which was not American tactical superiority in some abstract sense, but the observable, documented, specific fact that many of the Japanese pilots were flying as though they hadn't fully absorbed what combat at those speeds and in those tactical situations required. American after-action reports from the engagement, from individual squadron after-action reports to the comprehensive Task Force 58 combat assessment, use language that I find striking in its restraint and its implied pity. Several pilots noted, with what reads as genuine puzzlement, that Japanese formation cohesion was poor, that individual Japanese aircraft were leaving formation under attack when trained responses would have maintained it, and that torpedo bomber crews were continuing straight and level approaches toward carriers in the face of fighter interception, when any pilot with sufficient hours would have broken off or maneuvered. These were not cowardly pilots. They were undertrained pilots doing what their training had prepared them to do in a combat environment that their training had not prepared them for. The distinction matters. 250 hours looks like enough hours until it meets 800 hours in the same piece of sky. 4 separate Japanese strike waves, totaling approximately 373 aircraft across the day, were launched against the American fleet. The combined result? Approximately 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire, against a loss of approximately 23 American aircraft in the aerial combat itself. The ratio, roughly 13-1, was not the product of individual pilot quality differences alone. The variable time proximity fuse anti-aircraft shells that American cruisers and battleships had been firing since mid-1943 were achieving kill rates approximately 4 to 5 times higher than conventionally timed shells against the same target types. Japanese aircraft entering the American task force's anti-aircraft envelope in 1944 were entering a fundamentally different physical environment than Japanese aircraft had encountered in 1942. Not because the guns had changed significantly, but because the fusing system had made those guns dramatically more lethal. While the air battle was destroying the Japanese carrier air groups, American submarines were working beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, with equally consequential results. The submarine Albacore torpedoed the fleet carrier Taiho, the IJN's newest and largest carrier, specially designed with an armored flight deck and considered by the Naval General Staff to be the most damage-resistant carrier then afloat, with a single torpedo hit on the morning of the 19th. A single torpedo hit should not have sunk the Taiho. What happened was a damage control failure of a specific and avoidable type. Aviation gasoline vapors from ruptured fuel lines were ventilated through the ship rather than being isolated, and approximately 6 hours after the torpedo hit, the accumulated vapor found an ignition source. The Taiho exploded and sank. Later in the same day, the submarine Kavala found and torpedoed the veteran carrier Shokaku, which had survived Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and the Philippine Sea approaches, with 3 hits that proved fatal. The IJN lost 2 fleet carriers to submarine attack on the same day it lost 300 aircraft in the air battle above. The American pursuit on the evening of the 20th of June, Task Force 58's strike against the retreating Japanese fleet at extreme range as daylight was failing, is one of those episodes in the Pacific War where American success and American cost sat very close together. The strike found and attacked the Japanese fleet, sinking the carrier Hio and damaging several other ships. But the attack was launched so late in the day that many American aircraft ran low on fuel during the return flight. Approximately 80 American aircraft were lost, far more than had been lost in the actual combat over the Japanese fleet, when aircraft ran dry and ditched in darkness. 49 American pilots and crewmen died in what should have been a recovery operation. The United States replaced those 80 aircraft and 49 men within 3 weeks. Japan had lost approximately 480 aircraft and 445 aviators, figures that represented the destruction of the mobile fleet's entire carrier air group, the third catastrophic carrier air group loss since Midway. There was no replacement pipeline that could address losses at this scale in any time frame that mattered to the war. After the Philippine Sea, the IJN's carriers remained. 4 surviving fleet carriers and several smaller vessels, but they had no air groups. They were flight decks without aircraft, steel and fuel and anti-aircraft guns without the one weapon system that made them relevant in 1944. The Naval General Staff knew this. The decision about what to do with them, how to use carriers that had no aircraft, in a battle that would determine whether Japan held the Philippines, was the problem that Shogo planning would have to answer. The answer it found, as the next chapter explains, was to send the carriers north as bait and hope nobody noticed. The Last Throw. Leyte Gulf. Part 1. The Plan. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in October of 1944, gave post-war testimony to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey Team that is unlike almost any other document in the Japanese archive of this war. Most senior IJN officers in their USSBS interviews were careful, elliptical, professionally cautious about acknowledging the internal deliberations that had produced Japan's strategic decisions. Toyoda was something different. He said in the translated transcript, "If the worst should happen, there was a chance that we would lose the entire fleet. But I decided that the fleet should be used, even if it meant its total loss. If we failed, we would just have to make do with what remained." This is not the statement of a man in denial about his strategic situation. It is the statement of a man who has calculated the odds, found no good answers, and chosen the option he regards as least catastrophic among available alternatives. The plan he chose, Operation Shogo, needs to be understood in that context, because treating it as simple desperation misses what it actually was. Shogo, Victory Operation, was a contingency plan rather than a fixed scheme, designed to respond to whichever of several possible American offensive axes materialized: the Philippines, Formosa, or the Japanese home islands themselves. When American forces under General MacArthur landed at Leyte on the 20th of October 1944, Toyota activated the Philippine variant, Show 1, and the largest naval battle in history began its opening movements. The plan divided Japan's remaining combat ships into 3 separate forces with 3 separate roles. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 5 battleships including the Yamato and Musashi, 12 cruisers and 15 destroyers, would transit the Philippine Sea, pass through the San Bernardino Strait, and fall on the Leyte Gulf amphibious fleet from the north, destroying the transports that were still delivering MacArthur's forces and supplies. A southern force under Admiral Shoji Nishimura, with Admiral Kiyohide Shima's force following independently, would approach from the south through Surigao Strait, converging on the same target. And Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force, 4 carriers with approximately 108 aircraft, would position itself north of Luzon and present itself as an irresistible target for Admiral Halsey's fast carrier task force, drawing the most powerful American naval force away from the San Bernardino Strait and leaving Kurita a clear approach. The carriers in Ozawa's northern force had approximately 108 aircraft aboard. Ozawa himself, in his post-war testimony, was candid about what this meant. His air groups were so depleted, so inexperienced, that the carriers could not function as strike platforms in any realistic sense against American Task Force 38's combat air patrol and radar-directed fighters. The carriers were being sent north as bait. This was not a last-minute improvisation forced by the Philippine Sea losses. It was the deliberate operational assignment of Japan's remaining fleet carriers to the role of sacrificial lure, to be expended in drawing Halsey away from the battle's actual decisive point. Ozawa's 4 carriers were going to Leyte Gulf to die, and everyone planning the operation knew it. This is documented in the planning records and confirmed in post-war testimonies. The IJN sent its last carriers into battle, knowing they were going there to die, because the alternative use of those carriers, keeping them in harbour as empty steel, contributing nothing while the Philippines fell, was considered strategically worse than sacrificing them productively. The plan had a structural problem that was obvious to anyone who read it carefully. Its 3 forces had no joint communications protocol, no unified command arrangement below the level of the combined fleet headquarters in Tokyo, and no reliable common intelligence picture. Kurita's center force, Nishimura's southern force, and Ozawa's northern force would be operating simultaneously across approximately 500 miles of Philippine waters, each following its own operational timeline, each dependent on the others performing on schedule, without the ability to verify what the others were doing in real time. The plan required perfect coordination without the communications infrastructure to achieve it. This isn't retrospective criticism. It was a structural feature of the operation visible at the planning stage, accepted because no alternative could deliver the simultaneous convergence that Show 1 required to have any chance of success. The opening American submarine attacks on Kurita's center force in the Palawan Passage on the 22nd and 23rd of October demonstrated immediately how costly the plan's vulnerabilities would be. The submarines Data and Dace intercepted the Japanese formation in the narrow waters south of Palawan Island. They sank the heavy cruisers Atago, Kurita's flagship, and Maya, and heavily damaged the cruiser Takao. Kurita transferred his flag to the Yamato and continued. The submarines surfaced and transmitted detailed contact reports to Task Force 38 and 7th Fleet headquarters. Before a single carrier aircraft had been launched, the element of surprise, on which the convergence plan's timing depended, had been compromised. Halsey and Kincaid both knew exactly where Kurita was and what size of force he was bringing. In the Philippine Sea on the 24th of October, American carrier aircraft from Halsey's Task Force 38 struck Kurita's center force through the day in 5 successive strikes. The primary target became the super battleship Musashi, the Yamato's sister ship, 65,000 tons of displacement, 946-centimeter guns, protected by what the Naval General Staff believed to be the most extensive armor scheme ever installed in a surface warship. American aircraft struck the Musashi with at minimum 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits over approximately 10 hours of sustained attack. She capsized at 1935, taking approximately 1,023 of her crew to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. It required 10 hours and multiple American airstrike waves to sink the most heavily protected battleship ever built. Her sister ship, the Yamato, striking in the same formation through the same day, survived with manageable damage. The difference between the two ships' fates was not a design distinction. It was the geometry of attack vectors and the specific placement of fatal torpedo hits against the Musashi's portside flooding sequence. Kurita turned back west after absorbing the Philippine Sea air attacks, and Task Force 38 interpreted the turn as retreat, shifting some focus toward Ozawa's northern force when contact was established. But Kurita turned again east after dark, resumed his transit of the San Bernardino Strait, and emerged into the Philippine Sea in the pre-dawn hours of the 25th of October, to find the strait unguarded. Halsey had taken his entire fast carrier force north toward Ozawa. The decision that would be debated for decades had been made. The San Bernardino Strait was open. Kurita's 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and their destroyer screen sailed through it in darkness, turned south, and at dawn came upon Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's escort carrier group, on the horizon. Leyte Gulf, Part 2. The Battle That Ended the IJN. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's after-action report, filed on the 28th of October, 1944, contains a sentence that should be read before any tactical analysis of what happened off the coast of Samar on the 25th. At 0658, enemy cruisers opened fire. My task unit was clearly outclassed in gunpowder, speed, and armor. My destroyers and aircraft were the only weapons with which to fight back. He was commanding 6 escort carriers, thin-hulled, slow, lightly armed ships designed to support amphibious operations and hunt submarines, against Kurita's 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and their destroyer screen. The Yamato's main battery guns fired shells weighing approximately 1,360 kilograms. Sprague's escort carriers were built on merchant ship hulls. The engagement that followed over the next 2 hours was the most consequential naval action of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In the early hours of the same morning, in the Surigao Strait, 200 miles to the south, Admiral Nishimura's southern force had already been destroyed. Nishimura's 2 battleships, 4 destroyers, and heavy cruiser had steamed north into a carefully prepared American trap. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's force of 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers waiting in the darkness at the strait's northern end. The Japanese force was detected on radar long before it came within visual range. Torpedo attacks from American PT boats and destroyers struck repeatedly as Nishimura approached. When the Japanese battleship Yamashiro and her companions finally came within range of Oldendorf's battle line, they were struck by converging fire from cruisers on both sides and battleships crossing their course ahead. The T-crossing maneuver that naval tacticians had theorized for generations and executed rarely. The Yamashiro sank. Nishimura died with his ship. Admiral Shima's force, following independently with no coordination, arrived minutes behind Nishimura to find the strait full of burning wreckage and turned back without significant engagement. The Battle of Surigao Strait was the last battleship versus battleship action in naval history. Back at Samar, Sprague's response to Kurita's appearance was immediate, and, in purely tactical terms, almost certainly the only response that had any chance of working. His escort carriers turned southeast, away from the Japanese formation, toward the wind for flight operations, and made smoke. His 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts were ordered to attack. The destroyer Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, turned directly toward Kurita's formation and charged, making smoke and firing torpedoes at ranges that brought her within gun range of Japanese cruisers. She scored hits. She was hit in return, repeatedly, and eventually slowed and sinking still fired her remaining guns. The destroyer Hull and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts executed similar attacks. All 3 were sunk. What they bought, with their ships and the lives of their crews, was time and confusion. The smoke screens rolled across the water. American escort carrier aircraft made repeated attack runs with whatever ordnance they carried, including, in some documented instances, depth charges when bombs were exhausted. The attacks were not always effective by any precise damage metric. They were unceasing. Kurita's force, pressing southward toward the escort carriers through the smoke and under continuous air and surface attack, was interpreting the situation through incomplete information. The communications traffic he was intercepting suggested a major American fleet somewhere in the area. The aircraft attacking his ships were behaving with an aggression that, in his assessment, suggested they were from fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. Fleet carrier aircraft operated by pilots who expected to return to a ship with the fuel and ordnance capacity to support continued operations, not the last resort attacks of pilots who'd run out of bombs and were making passes with depth charges. His cruiser and destroyer screens were taking damage. The smoke made target identification extremely difficult. At 0911, having come within approximately 44 kilometers of the Leyte Gulf transports, the amphibious fleet that was the entire strategic reason for the Show 1 plan, Kurita ordered a turn to the north, away from Leyte Gulf. There is a source conflict at the center of the battle off Samar that I want to address directly, because it's the kind of unresolved historiographical question that honest engagement with the archive requires acknowledging. Kurita's explanation for his turn, given in various post-war interviews and dispatches, was that he believed he was engaging a major American fleet carrier group rather than an escort carrier force, that he was uncertain about American strength in the area, and that he was concerned about the fuel states of his ships after the previous day's engagements. Thomas Cutler's 1994 reconstruction of the battle, which is among the more rigorous recent analyses, argues that Kurita's intelligence picture at 0911 was genuinely ambiguous enough to make a cautious response defensible. Samuel Eliot Morrison's earlier official history treated the turn as a failure of nerve at the decisive moment. Both interpretations are supported by available evidence. The historical record does not permit certainty about what was happening inside the command decisions of a man under combat stress, working from incomplete information, in the middle of a battle that had already cost him 2 cruisers and a super battleship. To the north, Halsey's Task Force 38 had found Ozawa's northern force. The decoy had worked with complete success. Halsey committed his entire force, including the battleships that 7th Fleet's Admiral Kincaid believed were guarding the San Bernardino Strait, to the pursuit and destruction of Ozawa's carriers. American aircraft struck the northern force through the 25th of October, sinking all 4 carriers: the Zuikaku, which had survived Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and the Philippine Sea, the last survivor of the 6-carrier Kido Butai that had struck Hawaii, along with the Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Ozawa had achieved his operational objective completely. He'd drawn Halsey north and away from the San Bernardino Strait. Kurita had already turned back. On the same day, in Philippine waters south of Leyte, the kamikaze program made its first officially recorded ship sinking. The escort carrier St. Lo, a thin-hulled, slow, under-armored vessel that had been sailing through waters where the more powerful American carriers could not operate, was struck by a Zero carrying a bomb that penetrated her flight deck and detonated in the hangar below. The resulting fires reached stored ordnance. The St. Lo sank in approximately 30 minutes, taking with her 143 of her crew. The Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi's Special Attack Corps had been formally constituted only 6 days earlier. The first ship it sank was not a cruiser or a fleet carrier or a battleship. It was the smallest category of American carrier in the Pacific Fleet. The kamikaze program, as a weapon, was calibrated precisely to the targets it could realistically reach with the resources it had. The final accounting of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, across all 4 engagements, across the 23rd through the 26th of October, 1944, was 3 Japanese battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sunk, totaling approximately 305,452 tons of warship displacement. The figure represents 13.22% of all Imperial Japanese Navy warship tonnage losses during the entire Pacific War, expended in 4 days. After Leyte Gulf, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had surface ships remaining: destroyers, some cruisers, the Yamato, and several other battleships. What it didn't have was a carrier air force, a viable logistics system, adequate fuel, or a strategic concept that connected its remaining assets to any achievable objective. The IJN still existed on paper after Leyte Gulf. As a force capable of contesting control of the sea, it was finished. The Divine Wind. Kamikaze as strategic weapon. There is a moment in the historical record of October 1944 that I want to approach carefully, because it is almost universally handled badly, either with the kind of reverent cultural mysticism that treats the kamikaze purely as a window into Japanese spiritual psychology, or with the kind of clinical dismissiveness that reduces it to a failed tactical gimmick. Both framings miss what the program actually was: an operationally coherent weapons system adopted by a military institution that had exhausted its conventional options, created by a man who understood its moral dimensions with more clarity than his institutional position allowed him to act on. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi did not invent the kamikaze because he was irrational or fanatical or divorced from professional military reality. He invented it because the mathematics of conventional air attack in October of 1944 had produced hit rates so low against targets so well defended that the IJN's remaining air power was being consumed without proportionate effect. The program was his answer to a specific operational problem. Whether it was the right answer involves questions that go beyond operational analysis, and I don't think those questions have clean resolutions. The operational problem Onishi faced when he arrived in the Philippines as commander of the 1st Air Fleet in mid-October of 1944 was stark. He had approximately 100 operational aircraft. The American amphibious fleet at Leyte Gulf comprised hundreds of ships, protected by combat air patrol from fleet carriers, radar-directed anti-aircraft fire from cruisers and destroyers, and the proximity-fused shells that had been decimating Japanese air attacks since the Philippine Sea. Conventional bombing hit rates against American fleet units by this stage of the war were running at approximately 1 to 2% of sorties launched, meaning that for every 100 aircraft committed to a conventional strike, only 1 or 2 were achieving hits. At that attrition rate, Onishi's 100 aircraft would be consumed within weeks, while achieving negligible results. The mathematics drove him toward a different question. What hit rate would a pilot achieve if he was not required to pull out of his attack run? On the 19th of October, 1944, Onishi convened a meeting at Mabalacat Airfield with officers of the 201st Air Group. According to the account reconstructed in the 1958 book The Divine Wind, written by Rikihei Inaguchi and Tadashi Nakajima, both officers who were present in the Philippines during the campaign's formation, Onishi told the assembled pilots that Japan's situation in the Philippines was critical, that conventional air power could not achieve the hit rates necessary to affect the battle's outcome, and that he was proposing the formation of a special attack corps, whose method would be deliberate aircraft-into-ship impact. He ended his address with words that witnesses later recalled with substantial consistency. He told them he was asking them to do this at the sacrifice of their lives, that he did not say it lightly, and that he was himself prepared to die. Whether the pilots who responded affirmatively that night did so as genuine volunteers in any full sense of the word is a question the historical record cannot definitively answer for every individual present. What is documented is that the Shinpu Special Attack Force, the name Onishi gave the unit, using the Japanese reading of the characters that in Chinese reading produce kamikaze, was constituted that evening and flew its first missions within 5 days. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the first designated special attack mission. Seki is a figure who appears in multiple accounts with a detail that I find worth stating, precisely because it resists the narrative of pure ideological motivation. In the days before his mission, he reportedly expressed private reservations about the program to at least one journalist, questioning whether Japan truly had no other options. These accounts come from post-war sources and cannot be independently verified against contemporary documents. What is verifiable is that Seki flew his mission on the 25th of October, 1944, and struck the escort carrier St. Lo. The ship sank in 30 minutes. The hit rate of the first kamikaze mission, measured simply as aircraft committed versus ships sunk, was 100%. Against a conventional air attack that was achieving 1 to 2% hit rates, the operational difference was not marginal. It was the difference between a weapons system that was consuming itself without effect and one that was achieving its stated objective on every successful sortie. The program's operational effectiveness across its full deployment from October of 1944 through August of 1945 requires specific numbers to evaluate honestly. Approximately 3,860 kamikaze sorties were flown. Of these, approximately 475 to 548 achieved hits on Allied ships. Figures that vary between sources because the distinction between a direct hit and a near miss with structural effect was not always cleanly documented in after-action reports. The program sank 34 American warships, none larger than an escort carrier, and damaged approximately 368 others, killing approximately 5,000 American naval personnel. The hit-to-sortie ratio of roughly 14% was dramatically better than conventional air attack was achieving. By the purely operational metric of hits achieved per aircraft expended, the kamikaze was the most effective air attack weapon system the IJN deployed after 1942. It never sank a fleet carrier. This matters and needs explaining. The fleet carriers of Task Force 38 and Task Force 58 were protected by layered combat air patrol, radar direction systems that gave fighter direction officers minutes of warning before attack, and the same proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition that had devastated the conventional air attacks at the Philippine Sea. A kamikaze aircraft had to survive through that defensive envelope to reach its target. Many didn't. Those that did tended to strike the smaller, more lightly protected vessels, destroyer escorts, destroyer transports, landing ships, that were operating in the inshore areas where combat air patrol coverage was thinner. The program was tactically effective against the category of ships that were least important to American strategic capability. Against the fleet carriers that were the IJN's primary strategic concern, It achieved hits and damage, but not sinkings. I want to address the question of coercion in the program's expansion because it's a genuine historiographical controversy, and treating it as settled in either direction would be dishonest. The earliest special attack pilots were selected, by all available evidence, through a process with genuine voluntary elements, men who had been watching the war's trajectory and who made individual decisions about how they wished to face what seemed an inevitable outcome. As the program expanded across late 1944 and into 1945, requiring not dozens but thousands of pilots, the operational pressure on unit commanders to produce volunteers created social dynamics that made non-volunteering increasingly consequential in terms of professional standing and social relationships within the unit. The US SBS interviews with POWs and surviving participants noted specific instances of what the analysts described as effectively coerced volunteering. Japanese post-war accounts, including those of survivors and family members of pilots who died, reflect the full range, from men who sought out the assignment to men who accepted it under conditions that stretched the word volunteer considerably. Both realities coexisted within the same program. The archive supports neither a simple narrative of free heroic sacrifice nor a simple narrative of institutional coercion. Onishi himself provided the most complex evidence about the program's internal moral dimensions. When the Emperor's radio broadcast announcing surrender came on the 15th of August 1945, Onishi performed harakiri in his Tokyo residence, using a blade but refusing the coup de grace that would have ended his suffering quickly. He died over 15 hours. He left a death poem addressed to the pilots of the Special Attack Corps. His words, as translated from post-war accounts, told them they had fought well, had died bravely, and were, in his words, gods without guilt in this lost war. Whether his 15-hour death was an act of genuine atonement, a performative gesture calibrated to the cultural expectations of his station, or something more psychologically complex that neither description captures, the archive records the fact of what happened and declines to explain the interior. A man who built a system that sent thousands of young pilots to die chose to die in the manner of the pilots he had sent. What was happening inside that choice is beyond what documents can tell us. The program's most disturbing operational dimension, one that almost never appears in documentary treatments, involves the pilots who returned. A kamikaze sortie that failed to find its target, or whose aircraft was damaged before achieving impact, might return to base. Several documented cases exist of the same pilot flying multiple failed sorties before either dying or surviving to the war's end. The program, designed to end its participants' lives at the moment of success, required some of those participants to survive their own assigned death, return, and go again. The psychological dimension of that specific experience is essentially absent from both Japanese and American documentation. The archive has almost nothing to say about it. The Submarine That Wasn't. IJN Undersea Warfare and the Road Not Taken. There is a document in the archives of the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, a graduate thesis titled Operating Below Crush Depth: The Formation, Evolution, and Failure of Japanese Submarine Doctrine, completed in 2011, that contains one of the most analytically precise observations about the IJN strategic failure that I've encountered in this research. It is not a glamorous document. It is a professional military education thesis, the kind of thing that sits in an institutional archive and gets read primarily by the people writing similar theses in subsequent years. But its central argument is airtight. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force failed not because its submarines were inadequate, and not because its crews were incompetent, and not because the Americans defended their shipping too effectively. It failed because the IJN submarine doctrine explicitly ranked merchant shipping interdiction as the fourth priority mission for submarines, behind fleet battle support, fleet reconnaissance, and supply transport. Fourth, the mission that American submarines used to strangle Japan's war economy was, in the IJN's own official doctrine, less important than running supplies to isolated garrisons and watching American fleet anchorages. To understand how extraordinary this failure of strategic imagination was, you need to understand what the IJN actually had when it went to war in December of 1941. The Type 1 class submarines, large ocean-going vessels with a range of approximately 14,000 miles at cruising speed, capable of extended patrols across the full width of the Pacific, were among the most technically capable submarines in any navy at the time. Japan had also developed the I-400 class, the largest submarines built by any nation up to that point in history, displacing approximately 6,500 tons submerged, and capable of carrying 3 Aichi M6A Saran floatplane bombers in a pressurized, watertight hangar forward of the conning tower. The I-400 class had a range of approximately 37,500 miles, sufficient to circumnavigate the globe 1.5 times without refueling. The concept was breathtaking. Submarine-launched aircraft attacks on targets that surface ships could never reach undetected. Japan had built, by any technical measure, the most ambitious undersea weapon system of the entire war. And in the torpedo tubes of every IJN submarine sat the Type 95, the submarine-launched version of the Long Lance oxygen propulsion system, 610 millimeters in diameter, with a range and warhead performance broadly comparable to the surface-launched Type 93. No wake trail, no bubble signature, a weapon whose fundamental characteristics made it ideal for the commerce raiding mission that the IJN's Doctrine had ranked fourth. The IJN had the submarines, the crews, the range, and the torpedoes to conduct a merchant shipping campaign that could have threatened American Pacific logistics in 1942 and 1943 in ways that would have significantly complicated the Solomons campaign and delayed the Central Pacific Drive. They chose not to. The choice was not made under operational pressure or resource constraint. It was written into doctrine before the war began. The early months of the Pacific War offer a specific demonstration of the road not taken. In late 1941 and early 1942, IJNI-class submarines conducted patrols along the American West Coast. They sank a small number of American merchant vessels. I-17 bombarded the Elwood oil field near Santa Barbara in February of 1942, and I-25 subsequently shelled Fort Stevens in Oregon, the only foreign bombardment of a continental American military installation since the War of 1812. These attacks generated considerable alarm in American coastal communities. They achieved negligible strategic effect. More importantly, the submarines that conducted them were then recalled for fleet support duties as the Guadalcanal campaign developed. The American West Coast shipping lanes, carrying war materials, aircraft, vehicles, and supplies across the Pacific to the combat zone, were left largely unpatrolled and essentially unattacked for the remainder of the war. The contrast with American submarine operations requires stating plainly. American submarines sank approximately 1,314 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling approximately 5.3 million gross tons, along with 184 Japanese warships, including 1 fleet carrier, 4 escort carriers, 3 cruisers, and 42 submarines. This campaign, prosecuted by approximately 250 submarines, representing less than 2% of total American naval strength by tonnage, accounted for approximately 55% of all Japanese maritime losses during the Pacific War. The IJN's merchant shipping interdiction campaign sank approximately 184 Allied merchant vessels, totaling approximately 907,000 tons, roughly 17% of the American effort, against a target environment that was not materially better defended through most of the war's middle years. The ratio of effectiveness between American and Japanese submarine merchant warfare was approximately 6-1. Not because Japanese submarines and crews were inferior, because Japanese doctrine authorized one and not the other. The post-war explanations offered by IJN officers for this failure of strategic imagination fall into two broad categories that the documentary record supports unequally. The first, and most frequently cited in Japanese memoirs and post-war accounts, is cultural. Attacking unarmed merchant vessels was considered incompatible with the warrior's code, a form of dishonorable warfare beneath the standards of the Imperial Navy. The second explanation, visible in the operational doctrine documents themselves rather than in post-war memoirs, is simpler and more prosaic. Merchant shipping interdiction was categorized in official doctrine as a lower priority than fleet support tasks, with no reference to cultural prohibitions whatsoever. The Bushido explanation appears extensively in accounts written after the war ended, by men who were constructing narratives about why events unfolded as they did. The doctrine documents, which were written before the war began, when there was no narrative to construct, simply rank the missions in order without cultural justification. The gap between those two sources of evidence matters. We chose not to do it because it was dishonorable, and our doctrine ranked it fourth because fleet support was more important, are different institutional explanations with different implications for how we understand the failure. The I-400 submarines represent the most specific and poignant expression of the IJN's capacity for extraordinary technical innovation deployed in pursuit of the wrong objective. By the summer of 1945, a small strike force of I-400 class submarines had been assembled and was preparing for Operation Hikari, a planned attack using submarine-launched aircraft against the American fleet anchorage at Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands. Ulithi was, at this point, the primary forward base for American operations against the Japanese home islands, regularly holding hundreds of ships, including fleet carriers, battleships, and ammunition and supply vessels. An attack by submarine-launched aircraft against Ulithi, if it achieved surprise and adequate concentration, might have achieved significant damage to the American pre-invasion logistics buildup. The operation was being prepared when Japan surrendered. The I-400 submarines were captured intact, their Siran aircraft still in the hangars, their torpedoes still loaded, the mission never flown. American naval engineers who examined the captured I-400 submarines in the weeks after the surrender spent considerable time with the aircraft hangar design, the catapult launch system, and the pressurized storage arrangements. The subsequent classified technical assessment described the aircraft launch catapult as more advanced than any equivalent American system, and noted that the Siran aircraft could be armed, fueled, and launched within 30 minutes of surfacing, a rapid deployment capability that American submarine-launched aircraft concepts of the same period hadn't achieved. The United States Navy sank the I-400 submarines in deep water in 1946, citing concerns about Soviet intelligence exploitation. The most technically ambitious submarine weapons system of the entire war lies in the Pacific Ocean, largely unsurveyed, still carrying the engineering solutions to problems that took other navies decades more to solve. Yamato's Last Voyage, A Nation's Funeral at Sea. Mitsuru Yoshida was 22 years old when the Yamato sailed from Tokuyama on the 6th of April, 1945. He was a junior officer, present on the bridge during the ship's final hours, and he survived, one of 269 men out of 2,767 aboard, who came out of the water alive. He wrote about what he saw and experienced in a memoir published in Japanese in 1952, translated into English in 1985 as Requiem for Battleship Yamato. I want to use his account as the spine of this chapter, with the NHHC's technical assessments alongside it, because the human and the mechanical are inseparable in what happened off the coast of Kyushu on the 7th of April. You can't understand it from the technical record alone. You can't understand it from the memoir alone. You need both, holding each other honest. Yoshida records a conversation the evening before departure, the 6th of April, 1945, with a fellow officer whose name he does not give. The officer said, as Yoshida reconstructs it across 7 years of memory, "If we go out, we die. If we stay in port, we die. At least at sea, we die doing something." Yoshida wrote that he could not construct a logical counter-argument. This exchange has been quoted and re-quoted in histories of the battle since the English translation appeared, and there is a risk that repetition has dulled its meaning. What strikes me about it, sitting with it again in the context of everything this series has traced from December of 1941, is how perfectly it encapsulates the strategic position of the entire IJN in the spring of 1945. A force that had no good options remaining, choosing the option that at least produced action in place of waiting. The mission assigned to Yamato under Operation Tengo was, in its stated form, almost architecturally absurd. She was to sail from Tokuyama through the Bungo Strait, transit the East China Sea, reach the waters off Okinawa, beach herself on the shore, and use her 946-centimeter main battery guns as coastal artillery to support the Japanese garrison defending the island against American landings. The largest, most heavily armed battleship ever built, a ship designed for fleet engagements at ranges of 30 to 40 kilometers, with fire control systems calibrated for moving ship-to-ship combat, was being repurposed as a grounded artillery emplacement. Whether this mission plan was operationally serious, or whether it was, as some analysts have argued, a face-saving narrative attached to what was essentially a sacrificial sortie, the fuel allocation makes the intent visible without ambiguity. 2,500 tons of bunker fuel, approximately 40% of Yamato's 6,300-ton capacity. Enough for a one-way voyage, not enough to return. The decision was made and documented. The ship sailed. Yamato departed at 15:20 on the 6th of April, with an escort of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers. She carried 2,767 men, approximately 200 more than her standard complement, most of them young recruits who had never been to sea in wartime. American submarines and aircraft tracked the formation from the Bungo Strait southwestward. By the morning of the 7th of April, Task Force 58's carrier aircraft had the contact. The weather was partly cloudy, with enough high overcast to complicate navigation, but not enough to conceal a ship of Yamato's size from radar or visual sighting at low altitude. At approximately 12:22, the first American aircraft appeared on the Yamato's radar. At 12:32, the first attack began. What followed over the next 111 minutes has been reconstructed from multiple sources. Survivor accounts collected by Japanese researchers in the 1960s and 70s, the American Carrier Air Group strike reports filed after the battle, and the NHHC's technical analysis of the available evidence. Approximately 280 American aircraft from Task Force 58 participated in the attack. The tactical coordination specifically targeted the Yamato's port side with torpedo attacks. The American strike coordinators having determined that a concentration of port side hits would produce progressive flooding that the ship's counter-flooding systems could not adequately address. This was not guesswork. American torpedo doctrine by 1945 had evolved specifically to attack large, heavily compartmented ships through coordinated, multi-bearing saturation attacks designed to overwhelm damage control capacity. The doctrine had been developed, in part, from studying how the Japanese themselves had handled torpedo attacks in the Solomons, a specific irony the strike coordinators may or may not have appreciated. Yamato's main battery fired during the engagement. The 9 46-centimeter guns, the largest naval guns ever installed on a warship, elevated to low angles and loaded with the Type 3 anti-aircraft round, an incendiary shell designed to dispense approximately 900 sub-projectiles in a burst radius of roughly 90 meters. The concussion from firing the 46-centimeter guns at low elevation caused documented casualties among Yamato's own crew on adjacent decks and superstructure positions. Japan's most powerful weapons were injuring the men operating them in the ship's final hours. The anti-aircraft rounds that the guns were firing were theoretically capable of destroying aircraft at altitudes up to approximately 1,200 meters. American attack aircraft were approaching at lower altitudes, in numbers that no concentrated anti-aircraft barrage from a single ship, however large its guns, could adequately address. Yoshida's account of the ship's progressive flooding is among the most technically precise first-hand descriptions of major warship damage in the literature of naval warfare. The kind of detail that could only be remembered by someone who had been watching instruments and monitoring reports in the midst of chaos. He records the list growing, the orders for counterflooding, the counterflooding making the starboard compartments begin to flood in turn, the list continuing to increase past the point where any engineering response remained possible. At approximately 1405, with the list reaching somewhere between 30 and 35 degrees, the main magazines detonated. The explosion, the combined detonation of hundreds of tons of propellant and warhead explosive, produced a mushroom cloud visible from the Japanese mainland, approximately 180 kilometers away. American pilots in aircraft more than 100 kilometers distant reported seeing it. Yoshida was in the water. He saw the cloud from below. 2,498 men died with the Yamato. The ship had been under construction for approximately 25 months at Kure Naval Arsenal by more than 10,000 workers, completed at a cost roughly equivalent to the construction of several fleet carriers. She had been the most powerful individual warship in any navy in the world. Her main guns had fired at enemy ships in combat on exactly 2 occasions. At Taffy 3's escort carriers during the Battle of Samar, where they missed every shot, and at American aircraft during Operation Tengo, where the fire was ineffective. The total operational combat contribution of the largest battleship ever built across 3.5 years of Pacific War service was approximately 0 measurable strategic effect. Not because the ship was poorly designed, because the form of warfare for which she had been designed ceased to exist approximately 6 months after she was commissioned. When the wreck of the Yamato was surveyed in 1985 by a Japanese research expedition, the ship was found in approximately 340 meters of water, split into 2 major sections, lying approximately 1,000 meters apart, the bow section and the stern section, separated by the magazine detonation. The debris field between them covered hundreds of meters of ocean floor. Tools, personal effects, shell casings, structural fragments. Among the objects photographed by the remotely operated camera during the survey was a ceramic teapot, intact, sitting upright on the seafloor. The Yamato had capsized and sunk upside down. Any object that survived the sinking should, by the physics of an inverted hull, be inverted. The teapot sat upright, apparently righted by some combination of current and settling in the decades since. Yoshida, when shown the photograph many years after the war, identified the design as consistent with the ship's galley spaces. He did not elaborate on what he felt looking at it. The numbers that ended a navy. Industrial reality versus naval mythology. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's report on Japanese war production contains a table that I want to describe before quoting from it, because the context matters as much as the figures. The table tracks Japanese naval warship construction tonnage annually from 1940 through 1945. It was compiled not from Japanese planning documents, most of which were destroyed in August of 1945, but from the post-war testimony of Japanese production officials, cross-referenced against physical evidence at shipyards and the records of companies that supplied steel and specialized equipment to the naval construction program. It is, in other words, an approximation built from fragments. It is also the best available evidence, and what it shows is this. In 1941, Japanese naval shipyards produced approximately 236,000 tons of new warship construction. In 1944, 3 full years into a desperate war, with the naval construction program operating under emergency priority designations, the same shipyards produced approximately 196,000 tons, less than in 1941. The strategic bombing campaign and the material shortages produced by the submarine campaign had, by 1944, reduced Japan's naval construction output below the pre-war peacetime baseline at the moment of maximum need. Against this production figure, consider the losses. The IJN was losing warships at rates that varied between campaigns and years, but that consistently exceeded new construction across the war's middle and later periods. The replacement ratio, new hulls built versus operational hulls sunk, was running against Japan in every major ship category by mid-1943. But the category in which the deficit was most operationally severe wasn't fleet carriers or battleships, whose loss is most visible in the dramatic battle narratives. It was destroyers and destroyer escorts, the workhorses of convoy protection, anti-submarine warfare, fleet screening, and logistics support that sustained every other type of naval operation. American shipyards launched 349 destroyers and 420 destroyer escorts between December of 1941 and August of 1945. Japanese shipyards launched 63 destroyers in the same period. The ratio: approximately 12 American destroyers and destroyer escorts built for every 1 Japanese destroyer built. The war's outcome was inscribed in that ratio as clearly as in any battle. I want to give you the American production context with full specificity, because the scale of it is the context without which nothing else about the Pacific War's conclusion makes sense. The United States launched, between Pearl Harbor and the Japanese surrender, 18 fleet carriers, 9 fast battleships, 48 cruisers, 349 destroyers, 420 destroyer escorts, 203 submarines, and approximately 2,000 landing ships and craft of various types. During the same period, the United States also launched the entire Liberty ship program, approximately 2,710 cargo vessels, totaling more than 30 million gross tons, to supply Britain, the Soviet Union, and its own forces simultaneously across 2 oceans. The American industrial complex was building the equipment for 2 separate global wars, while the country was also absorbing and training approximately 12 million military personnel, operating a continental rail network at unprecedented capacity, and feeding a civilian population that, unlike Japan's, never faced serious food shortage. Japan's industrial system, formidable by any absolute measure, was competing against something of a categorically different scale. The submarine campaign deserves specific statistical attention because it is simultaneously the most decisive strategic operation of the Pacific War and the least celebrated in popular historical memory. Approximately 250 American submarines, operating from Pearl Harbor, from Fremantle in Western Australia, and from forward bases as the Pacific perimeter contracted, sank approximately 1,314 Japanese merchant vessels and 184 warships, accounting for roughly 55% of all Japanese maritime losses. The merchant fleet Japan had possessed at the war's start, approximately 5.4 million gross tons, was reduced to approximately 1.5 million gross tons by the surrender, with most of the remaining vessels lying in harbours too damaged to move or too poorly fueled to operate. The 8,600 and 18,000 gross tons of total Japanese merchant shipping losses across the war, a figure from the United States Naval Institute Proceedings Analysis of 1956, represents the complete destruction of the logistical foundation of Japanese war-making capacity. Japan couldn't move oil, couldn't move food, couldn't move soldiers, couldn't supply its garrisons. The submarines didn't win individual battles. They won the underlying condition that made all battles eventually pointless for Japan. The American submarine campaign's effectiveness came partly from technical improvements that the IJN's anti-submarine doctrine was consistently too slow to address. The Gato-class submarines with which America entered the war had an operational crush depth of approximately 300 feet. The Balao-class submarines that entered service from 1943 onward used higher strength steel in the pressure hull to achieve an operational crush depth of approximately 400 feet, a 33% increase in depth capability that made depth charge attacks significantly less effective. Japanese anti-submarine depth charges were routinely set for maximum detonation depths of approximately 200 feet through most of 1942 and 1943, based on pre-war intelligence assessments of American submarine operating depths that were already obsolete. By the time Japanese anti-submarine settings were updated, American submarines had already gone deeper, and the IJN's convoy escort force, never large enough, never prioritized adequately, was being worn down by the same operational tempo that was consuming the destroyers in the fleet screening role. The final accounting the JNAC Committee produced, the Joint Army-Navy Accounting Committee that compiled comprehensive Japanese shipping loss records after the war, contains a detail that I find genuinely instructive about the reliability of wartime reporting on all sides. The committee's work was initiated partly to settle inter-service credit disputes. The Army Air Forces, Navy Carrier Aviation, Navy Surface Forces, and Navy submarines all claimed kills that, when totaled, significantly exceeded the actual number of Japanese ships sunk. The combined American kill claims exceeded actual Japanese losses by approximately 300%. Every service was inflating its results, not through deliberate fraud, but through the universal difficulty of confirming kills under combat conditions, the fog of war, and the institutional incentives that attach to documented operational success. Japanese pilots had been doing exactly the same thing in the Solomons. The Americans were doing it too. The difference is that the Americans had the post-war institutional stability and the access to Japanese records to correct their own figures. The JNAC exists because the winners could afford the honesty of recalculation. By the time Japan's formal surrender documents were being prepared in the summer of 1945, the IJN had lost 334 warships, totaling approximately 1,120,000 tons of combat displacement, essentially its entire pre-war fleet. It had lost 300,386 officers and enlisted men killed, a number that represents roughly 1 in 3 of all naval personnel who served during the war years. It had lost approximately 11,000 aircraft, and the trained aircrew that had given the Zero and the Carrier air groups their operational effectiveness in 1941 and 1942. Against these losses, the United States Pacific Fleet had grown from approximately 381,000 tons of combat displacement at Pearl Harbor to approximately 3.2 million tons at the war's end, an increase of approximately 840% during a war in which it had lost approximately 36 major combatants, totaling roughly 150,000 tons. The war did not deplete American sea power, it manufactured it. The sea they left behind. Legacy, memory, and what the IJN changed forever. On the 2nd of September 1945, in Tokyo Bay, the formal instruments of Japan's surrender were signed aboard the American battleship Missouri. The senior surviving officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy stood on the deck of an American warship in waters the IJN had not been able to contest for more than a year, and affixed their seals to documents that ended the war their institution had started at Pearl Harbor 3 years, 8 months, and 26 days earlier. There were American officers present who had been at Pearl Harbor. There were Japanese officers present who had been at Midway. The deck of the Missouri on that September morning contained, in compressed form, the entire arc of what this series has traced: the overreach, the brilliance, the institutional failures, the individual courage, the arithmetic of industrial disparity, and the specific sequence of decisions and accidents and structural failures that had brought both sides to this particular ship, in this particular harbour, on this particular morning. The IJN had gone to war believing that a navy of sufficient quality could compensate for industrial inferiority through decisive action. The Missouri's deck, and everything that surrounded it, was the answer that history had returned. The immediate post-war assessment of the IJN's campaigns, conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey teams that fanned out across Japan and its former territories in the autumn and winter of 1945, produced a body of documentation that every major navy in the world used to restructure its doctrine, its force composition, and its weapons development priorities in the late 1940s and 1950s. The primary lessons the professional naval world drew from the Pacific War were not subtle. Aircraft carriers were the dominant capital ship. Battleships were fire support and shore bombardment platforms. Logistics and underway replenishment were the foundations without which no sustained naval campaign was possible. Anti-submarine warfare was not a secondary task, to be staffed with older ships and undertrained crews, but a primary operational requirement on which all other naval activities depended. Every major navy reorganized around these conclusions. The IJN's campaigns, its successes and its failures in roughly equal measure, became the empirical data from which the post-war naval architecture was built. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal addressed the IJN's wartime conduct in specific and limited ways. Specific flag officers were charged with responsibility for prisoner of war treatment violations and for unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant shipping, the latter charge carrying a certain institutional awkwardness given American submarine practice. What the tribunal did not address, because its legal framework had no mechanism for it, was the institutional accountability for the strategic decisions that had sent hundreds of thousands of Japanese naval personnel into a war whose outcome the Naval General Staff had predicted with reasonable accuracy in its own war games before it began. The men who suppressed the 1940 war game results that showed Japan losing any conflict lasting beyond 18 months were not charged with anything. The men who built a navy optimized for a 6-month war and then committed it to a 4-year one were not charged with anything. The law addressed what the law could address. The broader questions about institutional responsibility for predictable strategic failure went formally unanswered, as they typically do. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, the JMSDF, established under American supervision in 1954, made a deliberate institutional choice in its founding that tells you something important about how the surviving IJN officers understood what had happened to their navy. They did not call the new organization a navy. In Japanese, the word kaigun, navy, was specifically avoided. The new organization was designated Kaijo Jietai, Maritime Self-Defense Force, a bureaucratic designation that created explicit institutional distance from the Imperial Japanese Navy it was implicitly succeeding. Its first senior officers were IJN veterans trained in the naval traditions and tactical doctrines of the institution they were now officially not replicating. Its early doctrine was written with American naval advisors, using American operational frameworks, incorporating the lessons the Pacific War had demonstrated. It was simultaneously the IJN's institutional heir and its institutional repudiation, a force built from the same professional culture that had produced the Zero and the Long Lance and Kido Butai, reorganized explicitly around the lessons of why those things had ultimately failed. The JMSDF today, and here I want to be specific about the current state, because a series about this history should be honest about its contemporary relevance, operates helicopter-carrying vessels that are formally designated destroyers to avoid constitutional questions about aircraft carrier operation. A linguistic workaround that would have been entirely familiar to the pre-war IJN officers who called their aggressive strategic planning exercises defensive maneuvers. Japan's defense budget reached 2% of GDP by 2024, the most significant increase in Japanese defense spending since the post-war constitutional framework was established, driven explicitly by Chinese naval expansion in the Western Pacific and North Korean ballistic missile development. The JMSDF's planned submarine force, its F-35B acquisition program for its helicopter destroyers, and its ongoing development of long-range strike capabilities represent the most consequential Japanese military policy realignment since 1945. The ships are entirely different. The geographic constraints, the same straits, the same island chains, the same critical shipping lanes connecting the home islands to resource supplies, are identical. The territorial questions the Pacific War generated have not been resolved by the passage of 80 years. The Kuril Islands, occupied by the Soviet Union in the final days of the war and administered by Russia today, remain the subject of a formal Japanese sovereignty claim that has prevented Japan and Russia from signing a peace treaty to this day, making Japan and Russia technically still in a state of war that the Pacific War's ending didn't formally conclude between them. The Senkaku Islands, administered by Japan but claimed by China, sit in the East China Sea, in waters that IJN vessels patrolled in the 1930s and 40s. The South China Sea, where American submarines sank Japanese tankers by the dozen in 1943 and 44, is now the subject of overlapping territorial claims and maritime jurisdiction disputes that have made it one of the most geopolitically sensitive bodies of water in the world. The Pacific remembers the legal and territorial architecture of the war, even when the ships and the men and the specific violence are gone. I want to end this series with the number that I find most clarifying about what the IJN actually was and what the Pacific War actually cost. 300,386 naval personnel killed. That is the figure the post-war accounting produced for IJN losses across the entire Pacific War. Officers, enlisted men, pilots, submarine crews, destroyer sailors, the men aboard the Yamato on the 7th of April, the men in the landing boats at Guadalcanal, the men in the carrier air groups at Midway and Philippine Sea and Coral Sea. 300,386. The institutional failures I've traced across these 17 chapters, the suppressed war game results, the misallocated construction budgets, the doctrine that ranked merchant shipping interdiction fourth, the training pipeline that was stripped of its best instructors by the same operational tempo that burned through pilots. Those failures belong to the institution. The dying belong to the individuals. I think it's important to hold both of those things simultaneously, without letting one collapse into the other, because the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy is ultimately not the history of an institution. It is the history of the men the institution sent to sea. 300,386. Most of them were not admirals making decisions in Tokyo. They were engineers maintaining boilers on destroyers running the Tokyo Express on 4-hour sleep schedules. They were pilots with 250 hours flying into combat air patrol from faster, more structurally sound aircraft. They were sailors in the water off Samar and Midway and the Iron Bottom Sound, in the dark, a long way from home. The IJN built a navy of extraordinary quality and spent it completely. The Pacific War tested it against a force that could replace what it lost, at a rate no quality could overcome. The math was never in doubt. The men were real regardless. The sea they left behind, the wrecked carriers in the deep water north of Midway, the 38 wrecks in the Iron Bottom Sound, the Yamato lying in 340 meters of water off Kyushu, with its bow and stern separated by 1,000 meters of ocean floor, is a specific kind of archive. It doesn't lie. It doesn't rationalize. It doesn't produce post-war memoirs calibrated to institutional reputation. It simply holds what was sent into it, at the temperatures and pressures of the deep, unchanged by the decades. The teapot on the floor of the Philippine Sea, sitting upright in defiance of physics, in the debris field of the largest battleship ever built. The archive ends there.